Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we are venturing into the frozen heart of America's last frontier with 10 of the most disturbing, true Alaskan ghost town horror stories. These are not folklore or legends passed down through generations. These are documented accounts pulled from police reports, personal journals, survivor testimonies, and government records that have been buried in archives for decades. From the creature-stalked ruins of Portlock, where an entire community fled in terror, to the permafrost graves of Kennecott, where corporate secrets still lie frozen beneath the earth. Each story tonight represents a piece of authentic horror that officials hoped would never see the light of day. We will explore mining disasters that were deliberately covered up, government experiments that went catastrophically wrong, and encounters with forces that drove entire populations to abandon everything they had built in these remote settlements. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what really happens when civilization meets the untamed wilderness. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. And if you want to support my work bringing these buried stories to light, you can buy me a coffee by following the link in the description. Now, let us journey into the permafrost-preserved nightmares of Alaska's abandoned ghost towns, where temperatures drop below survival and the truth is even colder. I'm reading this from a journal I found in an estate sale in Anchorage. The seller said it belonged to her grandfather, Marcus Beaumont, one of the last residents of Portlock. She did not want to talk about why she was selling his belongings, but when I opened the leather-bound book and saw the first entry, dated March 15, 1949, I understood why she could not keep it in her house any longer. Marcus Beaumont had beautiful handwriting, the kind they taught in schools during the early 1900s. His entries started normal enough. Complaints about the weather, notes about the salmon run, observations about his neighbors, in what was then a thriving cannery town on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula. But as I read deeper into the journal, the entries began to change. The handwriting became more hurried, more desperate, and the content became something that would haunt anyone who read it. The first unusual entry was dated April 2, 1949. Marcus wrote, "Something has been watching the town from the tree line for 3 days now. Old Peter Svaznikov saw it first, standing maybe 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, just beyond the cannery. When Peter called out to it, the thing disappeared so fast, it was like it had never been there at all. But Peter swears he saw those yellow eyes watching us, calculating something we would not want to understand. I have spent months researching the history of Portlock, and what I found in official records does not match what Marcus Beaumont documented in his journal. According to the government records, Portlock was abandoned gradually due to economic factors and the construction of the Sterling Highway, which made other communities more accessible. The post office closed between 1950 and 1951, and residents slowly moved to nearby native villages like Nanwalek and Port Graham. But Marcus Beaumont's journal tells a different story entirely. April 8, 1949. Jimmy Hobson went hunting yesterday morning and has not returned. This would not be unusual, except that Jimmy knows these woods better than anyone. He was tracking a moose along the creek bed behind the old Russian church ruins when his wife Mary heard him scream. Not a yell for help, but a scream of pure terror that echoed off the mountains for what seemed like minutes. When the search party found his rifle 2 days later, it was bent in half like someone had grabbed both ends and folded it like a piece of paper. There was no sign of Jimmy anywhere. The journal entries from April became increasingly frantic. Marcus documented 3 more disappearances in the span of 2 weeks. Each time, the search parties would find evidence of a struggle: torn clothing, broken equipment, disturbed earth, but never a body. What they did find were tracks. April 20th, 1949. The tracks are everywhere now. 18 inches long, deep impressions in the mud that show 5 toes and what looks like claws. Thomas Larson measured them and said, whatever made these tracks would have to weigh at least 600 pounds and walk upright like a man. But no man has feet that size, and no bear leaves tracks like these. The elders are calling it Nantinak, the old Alutiiq word for the hairy one that steals people. They say their grandparents talked about this thing, but I always thought those were just stories to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. What Marcus described in his journal matches accounts I found from other sources, but with details that never made it into any official reports. The creature that was terrorizing Portlock was not just taking people, it was studying them, learning their patterns, their routines, their weaknesses. April 25th, 1949. Last night, something threw rocks at the Hendrickson house for over an hour. Not small stones, but boulders the size of watermelons that would crash into the walls and roof. When sunrise came and Emil Hendrickson went outside to investigate, he found the rocks arranged in a perfect circle around his house, like some kind of warning or territorial marking. But the most disturbing thing was what he found in the center of that circle. A pile of personal belongings from all the people who have disappeared. Jimmy Hobson's hunting knife, Sarah Nilsson's hair ribbon, Frank Peterson's tobacco pouch. It was like the thing was collecting trophies and wanted us to know it. The journal entries from May 1949 showed a community in complete terror. People were afraid to leave their houses after dark, and even during the day, no one ventured into the woods alone. The cannery workers were refusing to go to the outlying fishing stations, and several families had already packed up and left town on the monthly supply boat. May 3rd, 1949. Albert Petka tried to fight it. Albert was a tough old Russian who had been in Portlock since the cannery first opened in 1921. When the thing came for his dogs, Albert went after it with an axe and a rifle. We heard the gunshots around midnight. Then Albert screaming, then nothing. In the morning, we found Albert in his yard with his chest caved in, but he was still breathing. He lived long enough to tell us what he had seen. He said it was not an animal, not exactly human either, but something in between. It walked on 2 legs like a man, but it was covered in coarse, dark hair, and its face was wrong. Too long, too primitive, with teeth like a wolf. Albert said it moved faster than anything that size should be able to move. And it was smart. It had used his dogs as bait, knowing Albert would come out to protect them. After Albert Petka died from his injuries, the remaining residents of Portlock held a meeting in the cannery foreman's office. According to Marcus's journal, there were only 23 adults left in town, plus a handful of children. The decision they made would effectively end Portlock as a community forever. May 10th, 1949. We voted unanimously. Everyone leaves on the next supply boat, which should arrive within 2 weeks. Those who want to stay in Alaska will go to Port Graham or Seldovia. Others are talking about moving to Seattle or Vancouver, getting as far away from this place as possible. No one wants to say it out loud, but we are not just leaving because of the disappearances or even because of what happened to Albert. We are leaving because we know that whatever is out there in the woods is not going to stop until every one of us is gone. It has been picking us off one by one, learning from each attack, getting bolder and more aggressive. If we stay, we will all end up like Jimmy Hobson and the others. Just names on a list of people who walked into the Alaskan wilderness and never came back. But the most disturbing entry in Marcus Beaumont's journal was not about the creature itself, but about what happened after the decision to abandon Portlock was made. May 15th, 1949. The thing knows we are leaving. I do not know how it could possibly understand human speech or comprehend our intentions, but it does. Last night, it came right up to the edge of town and stood in the middle of Main Street, if you can call our little dirt road a street. Mrs. Davidson was looking out her window and said it just stood there for almost an hour, turning its head slowly to look at each house, like it was taking inventory. When the moon went behind a cloud and the street went dark, it disappeared. But this morning, we found something that chilled us all to the bone. Scratched into the dirt in front of every house was the same symbol, a circle with lines radiating out from the center, like the sun. The elders say this is an old Alutiiq symbol that means watching or waiting. The thing was telling us that even after we leave, it will remember us. The final entries in Marcus Beaumont's journal were written aboard the supply boat that carried the last residents away from Portlock in late May 1949. His handwriting had returned to its careful, measured style, as if the act of leaving that cursed place had allowed him to regain some composure. May 28, 1949. As we sailed away from Port Chatham Bay, I looked back at Portlock one last time. The buildings were already starting to look abandoned, even though we had only left hours before. The forest seemed to be creeping closer to the houses, and I could swear I saw something large moving between the trees near the old Russian Orthodox church. Captain Morrison said he would make one more supply run to Portlock in 6 months to pick up anyone who might have returned or any salvageable equipment. I told him not to bother. Some places are meant to be forgotten, and some things are better left undisturbed. But Marcus Beaumont's journal did not end there. He made one final entry 6 months later, dated November 15th, 1949. Captain Morrison went back to Portlock, despite my warnings. When his boat returned to Seldovia, he was white as a sheet and refused to talk about what he had found there. All he would say was that the town was different and that he would never set foot in Port Chatham Bay again. I convinced him to tell me what he had seen after several drinks at the Seldovia Inn. According to Captain Morrison, every building in Portlock had been systematically destroyed, not by weather or time, but torn apart by something with enormous strength. Roofs had been ripped off and thrown hundreds of yards into the forest. Walls had been punched through as if by giant fists. The cannery machinery, which weighed tons, had been overturned and scattered like toys. But the most disturbing thing was what Captain Morrison found in the center of what had been Main Street. The creature had built something there, a structure made from the debris of our houses, arranged in a complex pattern that hurt his eyes to look at. In the center of this structure was a pile of bones, human bones, arranged in the same circular pattern we had found outside the Hendrickson house. Captain Morrison counted at least a dozen skulls. He believes that everyone who disappeared from Portlock during those final months was kept alive somewhere, kept as prisoners until we left town. Then the creature killed them all at once, using their remains to build some kind of monument or warning. Captain Morrison said he could feel something watching him from the forest while he was there, but he never saw what it was. He just knew that if he stayed any longer, he would never make it back to his boat. I closed Marcus Beaumont's journal and sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what I had read. The details were too specific, too consistent, and too terrifying to be the product of imagination or folklore. But more importantly, they explained why the official records about Portlock's abandonment were so vague and contradictory. Who would believe a story about an intelligent creature that systematically terrorized an entire community into abandoning their homes? How would government officials file reports about something that did not fit into any known category of animal or human threat? It was easier to blame economic factors and changing transportation patterns than to admit that an entire Alaskan town had been driven away by something that should not exist. But I could not stop thinking about Captain Morrison's final trip to Portlock and what he had found there. If Marcus Beaumont's account was accurate, then somewhere in the ruins of that abandoned cannery town was evidence of one of the most disturbing mass murders in American history. More than that, it suggested that the creature responsible was still out there, still waiting in the Alaskan wilderness. I decided to research what had happened to the other survivors from Portlock, the families who had fled to nearby villages in 1949. What I found was deeply troubling. Over the next decade, Several of the Portlock survivors had died under mysterious circumstances. Some were reported as hunting accidents, men found mauled by bears in areas where bears were not known to be aggressive. Others simply disappeared while fishing or traveling between villages, their bodies never recovered. Marcus Beaumont himself had died in 1957 while visiting relatives in Port Graham. According to the death certificate, he had suffered a heart attack while walking alone near the beach, but his nephew later told investigators that Marcus's body showed signs of massive trauma, as if he had been struck by something with enormous force. The nephew also mentioned that Marcus had been acting strangely in the days before his death, claiming that something had been following him, watching him from the tree line. It is possible that Marcus Beaumont was simply a disturbed man who invented an elaborate story about monsters and disappearances. It is possible that the abandonment of Portlock was exactly what the official records claim, a gradual economic decline that led to residents relocating to more accessible communities. But as I held that leather journal in my hands, feeling the weight of all those careful entries and desperate observations, I could not shake the feeling that Marcus Beaumont had documented something real, something that the authorities either could not or would not acknowledge. Somewhere in the abandoned ruins of Portlock, Alaska, the truth is still waiting to be discovered. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Kenai Peninsula, something that learned to hunt humans 75 years ago might still be watching, still waiting, still remembering the taste of terror from a town that no longer exists. The question that haunts me most is not whether Marcus Beaumont's story was true, but whether the creature he described ever left that abandoned cannery town, or whether it is still there, building monuments from the bones of anyone foolish enough to venture into its territory. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. The woman on the line was sobbing. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said. "I need to tell someone what really happened to my great-uncle in Kennecott before I lose my nerve." I had been documenting Alaskan ghost town stories for 3 years, but something about Sarah's voice made me sit up in bed and grab my recorder. There was a desperation there, a weight that suggested she had been carrying this burden for far too long. "Take your time," I told her, settling into my chair. "Tell me everything." Sarah's breathing steadied slightly. "My great-uncle was Thomas Mitchell. He worked for the Kennecott Copper Corporation in the 1930s, right up until they closed the mine in 1938. But what I am about to tell you never made it into any official records. The company made sure of that." She paused, and I could hear her turning pages. "I found his journal 3 months ago when we were cleaning out my grandmother's attic. She died at 96, and right before the end she grabbed my hand and said, 'Sarah, find Tommy's journal. Tell them what really happened to those boys.' I had no idea what she meant until I started reading. The journal, according to Sarah, began normally enough. Thomas Mitchell had arrived in Kennecott in 1935, working as a tunnel foreman in the Bonanza mine. The copper operation was already winding down, but there was still work to be done, ore to be extracted, and tunnels to be maintained. The first strange entry is from October 15, 1935, Sarah continued, her voice growing steadier as she found her rhythm. Uncle Tommy wrote about a new shaft they had opened on the north side of the mountain. He called it the Midnight Tunnel because they only worked it during night shifts. The daytime crews refused to go near it. According to Thomas's journal, the Midnight Tunnel had been discovered when a dynamite blast had opened up a natural cavern system that extended deep into the mountain. The copper deposits there were richer than anything they had found before, but there was something else. The cavern had clearly been worked before, not by modern mining equipment, but by hand tools. Old hand tools. Uncle Tommy wrote that they found mining equipment down there that looked like it came from the 1880s, maybe earlier. Pickaxes, shovels, lanterns. But here's the strange part. There were no records of any mining operation in that area before Kennecott arrived. The company had purchased the land directly from the government, and there were no previous claims on file. Thomas's journal described how the night shift workers began reporting strange sounds echoing from the deeper parts of the midnight tunnel. Tapping sounds like someone working with a pickaxe. Sometimes they would hear voices, but when they investigated, they would find the tunnels empty, except for the old mining equipment scattered around as if it had just been used. The company brought in investigators, Sarah said. Uncle Tommy wrote that they were not regular mining inspectors. These men wore suits and carried briefcases, and they spent 3 days down in the midnight tunnel with measuring equipment and cameras. After they left, the company issued new orders. The midnight tunnel was to be sealed immediately, no explanations given. But Thomas Mitchell was curious. On the night before the tunnel was to be permanently closed, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He went down into the midnight tunnel alone. Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper as she read from the journal entry dated November 3rd, 1935. I have to write this down while I still remember it clearly, because part of me wants to forget what I saw down there. I brought 3 lanterns with me, but the darkness in that tunnel seemed to swallow the light. I could hear the tapping sounds getting louder as I went deeper, and then I started hearing the voices. According to Thomas's account, the voices were speaking English, but with accents and phrases that sounded decades out of date. They were talking about copper deposits, about working the seams, about someone called the superintendent, who would not let them rest. I followed the voices deeper into the cavern system until I came to a chamber that opened up into something massive. My lantern light could not reach the far walls, but I could see mining equipment everywhere. Pickaxes, shovels, ore carts, all arranged as if work had just stopped for the day, and then I saw them. Thomas Mitchell claimed to have discovered the bodies of at least 30 miners in that chamber. But these were not recent deaths. The bodies were naturally preserved by the cold and dry conditions in the cave, but their clothing and equipment suggested they had been there for decades, possibly since the 1880s. Uncle Tommy wrote that the bodies were positioned as if they had just lain down to sleep. Some were still holding their tools. Others were gathered around what looked like the remains of a campfire. But their faces, he wrote that their faces looked peaceful, like they had finally found rest. Sarah paused to take a drink of water before continuing. But that was not the worst part. As Uncle Tommy was examining the scene, he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned around, he saw 3 men walking toward him through the darkness. They were dressed in mining clothes from the 1880s, and they were carrying lanterns that gave off no light. The 3 figures, according to Thomas's journal, approached him calmly. They did not seem surprised to see him there. The eldest of the 3, a man with a gray beard and kind eyes, spoke to Thomas in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. He told me his name was Charles Brennan, and that he had been the mine superintendent for the first copper operation in that area. He said they had been working those tunnels since 1882, but something had gone wrong. A cave-in had trapped them all, and they had died slowly in the darkness, waiting for rescue that never came. Charles Brennan had explained to Thomas that they had been trying to finish their work ever since, unable to rest until the copper was properly extracted and the tunnels were safe for other miners. They had been the source of the tapping sounds and the voices, the spirits of miners still trying to complete their final shift. Uncle Tommy asked why no one knew about their operation, why there were no records. Charles Brennan told him that their company had been operating illegally, without proper claims or government permits. When they disappeared, it was easier for everyone involved to pretend they had never existed at all. But Charles Brennan had one more revelation that would change Thomas Mitchell's understanding of everything. The Kennecott Corporation knew about them. The company had discovered the bodies years earlier, but had covered up the discovery to avoid complications with their own mining operations. The suited investigators who had visited the midnight tunnel were not there to study the copper deposits. They were there to figure out how to permanently hide the evidence of the earlier mining operation and the deaths of 30 men. Charles Brennan told Uncle Tommy that the company was planning to seal the tunnel with explosives, trapping their bodies forever. He begged Tommy to tell someone to make sure they got a proper burial, to let the world know what had happened to them. Thomas Mitchell had promised Charles Brennan that he would find a way to tell their story, but when he returned to the surface and tried to report what he had found, he discovered that the company had anticipated this possibility. The next morning, Thomas was called into the supervisor's office and told that he was being transferred immediately to the company's operation in Arizona. His replacement was already on the way to Alaska. Uncle Tommy wrote that they gave him 24 hours to pack his belongings and catch the next boat to Seattle. When he asked about the midnight tunnel, his supervisor told him the tunnel had been permanently sealed the night before due to safety concerns. He also mentioned that miners who talked about unsafe working conditions or made up stories about things they thought they saw underground often found it difficult to get work anywhere else in the industry. Sarah's voice became bitter as she continued. Uncle Tommy understood the threat. He had a wife and 2 young children to support, so he took the transfer to Arizona and never spoke publicly about what he had found in the midnight tunnel. But he never stopped thinking about those 30 miners trapped in the darkness. Thomas Mitchell had spent the rest of his career trying to find a way to honor his promise to Charles Brennan. He had written letters to government officials, contacted newspapers, and even tried to reach out to historical societies, but the Kennecott Corporation had been thorough in erasing all evidence of the earlier mining operation. There were no records, no missing person reports, no family members looking for lost miners who had supposedly never existed. The journal entries from his later years are heartbreaking, Sarah said. Uncle Tommy wrote about having nightmares where he could hear the tapping sounds from the sealed tunnel. He wrote about seeing Charles Brennan in his dreams, asking him why he had not kept his promise. The guilt was eating him alive. Thomas Mitchell had died in 1967, taking his secret with him to the grave, but he had left instructions for his journal to be passed down through the family, hoping that someday someone would be able to tell the story he had been too afraid to share. I have been researching this for months now, Sarah told me. I contacted the National Park Service since Kennecott is now a historic site. I spoke with historians, with mining experts, with anyone who would listen. And you know what I found? Nothing. There are no records of any mining operation in that area before Kennecott. No missing person reports from the 1880s. No Charles Brennan listed in any mining company rosters. But Sarah had not given up. She had used modern genealogy resources to search for Charles Brennan and had found something interesting. There had been a Charles Brennan who worked for various mining companies in the American West during the 1880s, and he had disappeared in 1882 while working on a copper prospect in Alaska Territory. His wife had filed a missing person report, but he had never been found. I found records for 6 other miners who disappeared in the same area during the same time period. All of them were working for small, independent mining companies that went out of business shortly after their employees vanished, and all of their disappearances were written off as miners who had simply moved on to other opportunities without telling anyone. Sarah had also made a disturbing discovery about the Kennecott Corporation's records. While most of the company's historical documents had been donated to various archives, there was a 20-year gap in their files from 1918 to 1938. According to the company, those records had been lost in a warehouse fire in Seattle in 1955. But I found insurance records for that warehouse, Sarah said. There was no fire in 1955. The Kennecott Corporation deliberately destroyed those files, and I think I know why. I think Uncle Tommy was not the only person who knew about the bodies in the midnight tunnel. I think the company had been covering up that discovery for decades. As Sarah's story came to an end, I found myself believing every word. The details were too specific, too consistent, and too emotionally charged to be fabricated. But more than that, Sarah's account fit a pattern I had seen in other corporate cover-ups from that era: the sudden transfers, the veiled threats, the convenient disappearance of records. I am calling you because I do not know what else to do, Sarah concluded. I made a promise to my grandmother, and through her, to Uncle Tommy and to Charles Brennan. Those 30 miners deserve to have their story told. They deserve to be remembered. And maybe, if enough people know the truth, someone with more resources than I have can figure out a way to give them the proper burial they never received. After Sarah hung up, I sat in the darkness for a long time thinking about her story. The Kennecott mine had been closed for over 80 years, and the entire site was now protected as a National Historic Landmark. The Midnight Tunnel, if it had ever existed, would be somewhere under tons of ice and rock by now. But sometimes, late at night, I think about Thomas Mitchell's journal and Charles Brennan's final request. Somewhere in the frozen mountains of Alaska, 30 miners may still be waiting for someone to tell their story. And maybe, just maybe, they're still tapping away in the darkness, still trying to finish their final shift. Professor Elena Rodriguez thought she was writing a simple historical paper on the Chilkoot Trail, but when she started interviewing descendants of Daya survivors, she uncovered something the history books deliberately left out. What she discovered would change everything we thought we knew about the deadliest event of the Klondike Gold Rush, and why an entire town disappeared from the map forever. Elena had been teaching Alaskan history at the University of Alaska Anchorage for 15 years when she decided to focus her sabbatical research on the Palm Sunday avalanche of April 3, 1898. The official records were clear enough. 60 to 70 gold prospectors had died when multiple avalanches struck the Chilkoot Trail near a place called the Scales. It was a tragic but straightforward story of natural disaster meeting human ambition in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. But Elena Rodriguez was the kind of historian who believed that official records only told part of any story. She wanted to find the human voices behind the statistics, the personal accounts that would bring the tragedy to life for her students. So she began reaching out to genealogical societies and family history groups, looking for descendants of Daya residents who might have preserved letters, diaries, or oral histories from that fateful spring of 1898. The first anomaly appeared in a letter she received from Margaret Thompson, whose great-great-grandfather had operated a supply store in Daya during the gold rush. "Dear Professor Rodriguez," Margaret wrote, "I have been researching my family history for 20 years, and I have found something about the avalanche that has troubled me deeply. My ancestor, James Thompson, wrote in his private journal that the avalanche was not entirely natural. I know this sounds impossible, but I have documentation that I think you should see." Elena arranged to meet Margaret at her home in Wasilla, where she was shown a collection of documents that had been passed down through 5 generations of the Thompson family. The centerpiece was James Thompson's business ledger, which doubled as a personal diary during his time in Daya. The entries from early 1898 painted a picture of a community consumed by greed, desperation, and increasingly dangerous competition. February 15th, 1898. Elena read aloud from the faded pages. The Harriman Consortium has been surveying the avalanche zones above the Scales for 3 weeks now. They claim to be planning safety improvements for their transportation company, but I have seen them placing charges in areas that would cause slides if detonated. When I asked their foreman about this, he told me to mind my own business if I wanted to keep selling supplies to their crews. Elena looked up at Margaret. "Who is the Harriman Consortium?" Margaret pulled out a folder of newspaper clippings. "That took me years to figure out. They were a group of wealthy investors from Seattle who had put millions of dollars into building a tramway system on the Chilkoot Trail, but they were in direct competition with the Chilkoot Railroad and Transport Company, which was building a different route. Whoever finished their project first would control all the freight traffic between Daya and the Klondike goldfields. It was worth an enormous amount of money." Elena continued reading from James Thompson's journal. The entries from March 1898 showed increasing tension between the competing companies and growing concern among Daya residents about the dangerous rivalry playing out on the mountain above their town. March 8, 1898. 3 more men from the CR&T company disappeared near the scales yesterday. Their foreman claims they deserted to join prospecting parties heading north, but their personal belongings are still in their tents and their wages were never collected. Thomas McKinnon, who hauls supplies up the trail, told me he has seen armed men from both companies patrolling the construction zones at night. This is no longer about building tramways. This has become a war, and innocent stampeders are going to pay the price. But the most disturbing entry was dated March 30th, just 4 days before the Palm Sunday avalanche. March 30th, 1898. I have learned something that chills me to the bone. Jonathan Hartwell, who works as a surveyor for the Harriman Consortium, came to my store drunk and desperate tonight. He told me that his company has been planning to trigger a controlled avalanche that would destroy the CR&T company's construction works and kill their entire crew. He said they have been placing dynamite charges in the snowpack for weeks, waiting for the right weather conditions. But Hartwell has realized that the avalanche they are planning will be much larger than they anticipated. It will sweep down the entire mountainside and kill hundreds of stampeders who happened to be on the trail that day. He wanted to know if I could get word to the authorities in Skagway, but I told him that by the time any message reached them, it would be too late. Elena set down the journal and stared at Margaret. This is accusing the Harriman Consortium of deliberately causing the Palm Sunday avalanche. That would make it mass murder, not a natural disaster. Margaret nodded grimly. Keep reading. It gets worse. Elena turned to the entry dated April 3rd, 1898, the day of the avalanche itself. April 3rd, 1898. It happened exactly as Hartwell predicted. The avalanches began before dawn and continued throughout the morning, but these were not natural slides caused by unstable snow conditions. I could hear the explosions echoing off the mountains, carefully timed detonations that brought down tons of snow and ice in precisely the areas where the CR&T construction crews were working. By noon, at least 60 people were dead, including every member of the rival company's crew. The Harriman Consortium has eliminated their competition and cleared the way for their own tramway project, but the cost in human lives is beyond calculation. But James Thompson had documented something even more sinister. According to his journal, the avalanche had been deliberately timed to coincide with the weekly supply caravan from Daya to the scales, when the trail would be packed with stampeders carrying gold dust and nuggets back toward civilization. April 4th, 1898. I now understand the true scope of this crime. While rescue crews were digging for survivors, men working for the Harriman Consortium were systematically looting the bodies and the scattered equipment of the avalanche victims. They made off with thousands of dollars worth of gold, claiming it was salvage from the disaster zone. When families of the victims asked about personal effects and valuables, they were told that everything had been buried too deep to recover or swept away by subsequent snowslides. Elena looked up from the journal. Did anyone report these allegations to the authorities? Margaret opened another folder. That is where the story gets really disturbing. According to family letters, James Thompson tried to report what he knew to the U.S. Marshal in Skagway, but when he arrived for his scheduled meeting, he was told that the marshal had been transferred to Seattle on urgent business. The deputy marshal who met with him instead was a man named William Harrison, who, according to incorporation documents I found in the Seattle archives, was a silent partner in the Harriman Consortium. Elena spent the next several months tracking down other descendants of Daya residents, and the pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. Family after family had preserved documents, letters, and oral histories that suggested the Palm Sunday avalanche had been deliberately triggered by business interests who were willing to commit mass murder to protect their investments in the Klondike gold trade. The most compelling evidence came from the descendants of Dr. Charles Woodruff, who had served as the unofficial physician for the Daya community. His medical records, preserved by his granddaughter in Juneau, contained detailed autopsy notes on the avalanche victims that contradicted the official reports. Many of the bodies recovered from the avalanche zone showed signs of injuries that occurred before the snowslide. Elena read from Dr. Woodruff's notes. Gunshot wounds, knife wounds, blunt force trauma to the head and chest. At least 20 of the victims had been murdered before the avalanche buried them. I attempted to report these findings to the territorial authorities, but I was informed that my services were no longer needed and that any further speculation about the cause of deaths would result in the loss of my medical license. Elena's research revealed that Dr. Woodruff had been forced to leave Alaska shortly after the avalanche, despite having built a successful practice in Daya. His medical practice was taken over by a physician who had financial ties to the Harriman Consortium and who filed amended death certificates listing all avalanche victims as having died from exposure and asphyxiation due to natural disaster. But perhaps the most damning evidence Elena uncovered was buried in the corporate records of the Harriman Consortium itself. A Seattle law firm had donated the company's archives to the University of Washington in 1975, and Elena spent weeks going through boxes of correspondence, financial records, and internal memos. In a letter dated March 15, 1898, consortium leader Edward Harriman had written to his business partners, "The CR&T company must be eliminated before they complete their tramway project. I have consulted with our engineering specialists, and they believe that a series of controlled explosions could trigger snow slides that would appear entirely natural while accomplishing our business objectives. The cost will be significant, but the potential profits from controlling Chilkoot trail traffic justify any necessary expenditures." A follow-up memo dated April 5th, 2 days after the avalanche, was even more explicit. Project Snowslide has been completed successfully. All CR&T personnel have been eliminated, and their construction equipment has been destroyed. Salvage operations have recovered approximately $47,000 in gold and valuable materials from the disaster zone. Trail traffic can be diverted to our northern route within 6 weeks, giving us complete control of freight transportation to the Klondike. Elena also discovered that the Harriman Consortium had paid substantial bribes to territorial officials to ensure that no thorough investigation of the avalanche would be conducted. A ledger entry from April 1898 showed payments totaling $15,000 to territorial administrative expenses and investigation cost mitigation. The cover-up had been thorough and effective. Within 6 months of the Palm Sunday avalanche, the Harriman Consortium had completed their tramway project and gained a monopoly on freight transportation between Daya and the Klondike goldfields. The competing CR&T company had been dissolved, and their investors had lost everything. Most importantly, the avalanche had served as a convenient explanation for the disappearance of dozens of people who had been witnesses to the consortium's criminal activities. But Elena discovered that the conspiracy had even deeper implications for the fate of Daya itself. As word spread among the survivor community about the true cause of the avalanche, more and more residents began leaving the town. They were afraid, not just of future avalanches, but of the powerful business interests that had shown they were willing to commit mass murder to protect their profits. A letter from Sarah McKinnon to her sister in Seattle, dated June 1898, captured the fear that was driving families away from Daya. "We cannot stay here any longer. Too many people know the truth about what happened on the mountain, and there have been too many convenient accidents befalling those who might talk to the wrong people. James Thompson's store burned down last week, with him inside it. Dr. Woodruff left for Seattle after receiving death threats. The avalanche was just the beginning. These men will kill anyone who threatens their business, and we have seen what they are capable of doing." Elena's research revealed that the exodus from Daya had accelerated throughout 1898 and 1899, not because of economic factors as the official histories claimed, but because the community had been systematically terrorized by the very business interests that profited from the Klondike gold trade. Families who might have stayed and rebuilt their lives instead fled to other communities or left Alaska entirely, carrying with them the knowledge of what had really happened during the Palm Sunday avalanche. By 1900, Daya's population had dropped from a peak of over 8,000 residents to fewer than 500. The post office closed, businesses shuttered, and town began its slide into abandonment. The Harriman Consortium, having achieved their business objectives, moved their operations to Skagway and eventually sold their transportation assets to larger railroad companies. Elena finished her research with a profound sense of sadness and outrage. The Palm Sunday avalanche had not been a natural disaster. It had been a carefully planned massacre designed to eliminate business competition and cover up the theft of millions of dollars in gold. 60 to 70 innocent people had died not because of unstable snow conditions, but because wealthy investors had decided that human lives were an acceptable cost of doing business in the Alaskan frontier. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that the cover-up had been completely successful. For over a century, historians had accepted the official explanation of the avalanche as a tragic but natural disaster. The victims had been memorized as unlucky prospectors who had died pursuing their dreams of gold, when in reality, they had been murdered by the very people who were supposed to be helping them reach the Klondike. Elena submitted her research findings to several historical journals, but her work was consistently rejected. Editors told her that her conclusions were too speculative, that she was making serious accusations without sufficient evidence, and that her research would be harmful to Alaska's tourism industry if published. One editor wrote, "Even if your allegations are true, what purpose would be served by reopening this century-old case? The people responsible are long dead, and the survivors and their families have moved on." But Elena Rodriguez had not spent 2 years researching the truth about Daya just to see it buried again. She published her findings independently and began speaking at historical conferences and community events throughout Alaska. Slowly, other researchers began examining the evidence she had uncovered, and additional documentation began to surface from family archives and forgotten government records. Today, Elena's work has begun to change how historians understand not just the Palm Sunday avalanche, but the entire pattern of corporate violence and corruption that characterized the Klondike Gold Rush era. Daya did not become a ghost town because of economic factors or transportation changes. It became a ghost town because an entire community was driven away by the knowledge that they were living at the mercy of people who viewed human life as just another business expense. The truth about Daya reminds us that some ghost towns are haunted not by supernatural forces, but by the very real ghosts of greed, violence, and injustice that continue to echo through generations of silence. Every summer, the Henderson family held their reunion in Juneau, but in 2019, Grandmother Ruth finally told them why she never, ever wanted to visit the Treadwell ruins across the water. What she revealed about the mine flooding of 1917 would change everything they thought they knew about their family history, and why certain sounds still made her wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Ruth Henderson had been 87 years old when her grandson David first suggested they include the Treadwell Historic Trail in their family reunion activities. "It would be educational," he had argued, "and it's right here in our backyard. We've been coming to Juneau for 20 years, and none of us have ever explored the mine ruins." Ruth's reaction had been immediate and absolute. "No," she had said, her voice carrying a finality that surprised everyone in the room. "We will not be going to that place. Ever." For years, the family had accepted Ruth's inexplicable aversion to the old mining site across Gastineau Channel. They assumed it was simply an elderly woman's discomfort with walking on uneven trails, or perhaps some vague superstition about abandoned places. But in 2019, as Ruth's health began to decline, and she realized she might not have many more family reunions, she made a decision that would haunt her descendants for generations. "I need to tell you something about Treadwell," she announced during their traditional Saturday evening dinner at the Twisted Fish Company. "Something about why we can never go there, and why our family has been carrying a terrible secret for over a century." David Henderson, Ruth's youngest grandson and a journalist with the Anchorage Daily News, immediately pulled out his phone to record her words. Ruth noticed and nodded her approval. "My great-grandfather was Thomas Anderson," Ruth began, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "He came to Alaska from Sweden in 1903 to work in the Treadwell mines. The official records show that he died in the mine cave-in and flooding of April 1917, but that is not the whole truth. Thomas Anderson died weeks before the cave-in, and he was murdered to keep him quiet about something that would have destroyed the mining company if it had ever become public." Ruth reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather pouch that none of her family members had ever seen before. Inside was a collection of documents wrapped in oiled cloth, letters written in Swedish, company memos, and what appeared to be official reports. These papers were hidden in the walls of Thomas's boarding house room, Ruth continued. "When the building was torn down in 1923, his roommate found them and gave them to my grandmother. She never showed them to anyone because she was afraid of what might happen to our family if the wrong people learned what Thomas had discovered about the mines." According to Ruth's translation of Thomas Anderson's letters to his brother in Sweden, the Treadwell mining operation had been using child labor in the most dangerous parts of the underground workings since at least 1905. Boys as young as 10 years old were being sent into narrow shafts and unstable areas where adult miners could not safely work. The company recruited these children from orphanages in Seattle and San Francisco, Ruth explained, reading from one of Thomas's letters dated November 1915. They were told they would receive education and job training, but instead they were worked 14 hours a day in conditions that killed them regularly. Thomas wrote that in his 12 years at Treadwell, he had seen at least 60 children die in mining accidents that were never officially reported. But the use of child labor was not the worst secret that Thomas Anderson had uncovered. In early 1917, he had discovered that the mine's structural instability was far more severe than company officials were admitting to investors or government regulators. The underground support pillars were failing throughout the mine complex, and engineers had warned management that a catastrophic collapse was inevitable. Thomas wrote that the company had 3 choices, Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger as she delved deeper into the story. They could spend millions of dollars reinforcing the mines. They could gradually shut down operations and evacuate the area, or they could find a way to collect insurance money from a disaster while eliminating evidence of their illegal use of child labor. According to these documents, they chose the third option. David looked up from his phone. "Are you saying the mine cave-in was deliberate?" Ruth nodded grimly. Thomas discovered that company engineers had been deliberately weakening structural supports in key areas of the mine. They were planning to trigger a controlled collapse that would flood the mines with seawater and wash away any evidence of the children who had died down there. The insurance payout would cover their losses, and they could blame the disaster on natural geological instability. But Thomas Anderson had learned about the plan because of an accident. On March 8, 1917, while working in a section that was supposedly being reinforced, he had witnessed company engineers placing explosive charges in support pillars rather than strengthening them. When he confronted his supervisor about what he had seen, he was told to mind his own business and report for a different work assignment the following day. Thomas became suspicious and started paying attention to which areas of the mine were being reinforced and which miners were being reassigned to different sections, Ruth continued. What he discovered was that all the adult miners were being gradually moved away from the areas where the explosives were being placed. But the children who worked in the narrow shafts were still being sent into those same dangerous zones every day. According to Thomas's letters, he realized that the planned cave-in was not just intended to destroy evidence of child labor violations. It was meant to kill the child workers who could serve as witnesses to the company's crimes. The collapse would bury their bodies permanently under millions of tons of seawater and debris. Thomas wrote to his brother that he could not stand by and watch dozens of children be murdered just to protect the company's profits, Ruth said. So on March 20th, 1917, he sent a letter to federal authorities in Seattle, detailing everything he had discovered about the illegal use of child labor and the planned mine collapse. Ruth pulled out a carbon copy of the letter, yellowed with age but still legible. David read it aloud to the rest of the family. To the Federal Mining Safety Commission, I am writing to report serious violations of federal labor laws and imminent safety threats at the Treadwell mining operation on Douglas Island, Alaska. Company officials are knowingly using children as young as 10 years old in dangerous underground work, resulting in numerous unreported fatalities. Additionally, I have evidence that company engineers are planning to deliberately trigger a mine collapse to destroy evidence of these crimes and eliminate witnesses. I request immediate federal investigation and intervention to prevent loss of life. But Thomas Anderson's letter had never reached the federal authorities. Instead, it had been intercepted by a company security officer who reported directly to Treadwell management. 3 days after Thomas sent his letter, he was called to a meeting with Mine Superintendent John Kinsey. Thomas wrote one final letter to his brother on March 23rd, Ruth said, opening the last document in the collection. He knew he was in danger, but he thought he could convince the superintendent to abandon the plan to murder the children. This letter was found hidden under his mattress after he disappeared. The final letter revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that Thomas Anderson had uncovered. The Treadwell Mining Company had been systematically covering up child fatalities for over a decade, bribing territorial officials to ignore safety violations and manipulating insurance policies to profit from planned disasters. The April 1917 cave-in was to be the culmination of their criminal enterprise, a fake natural disaster that would eliminate evidence and witnesses while generating millions of dollars in insurance claims. Thomas wrote that Superintendent Kinsey had offered him a promotion and a transfer to the company's operations in Chile if he would keep quiet about what he knew. Ruth continued. When Thomas refused, Kinsey told him that men who made trouble for the company had a tendency to meet with unfortunate accidents in the mines. Thomas Anderson was found dead in his boarding house room on March 25, 1917. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but his roommate reported that Thomas's body showed signs of having been beaten before he died. No investigation was conducted, and Thomas was buried quickly in the Douglas Cemetery before any of his friends could examine the body. But Thomas's death did not stop the company's plan, Ruth explained. On April 21, 1917, explosive charges that had been planted throughout the mine complex were detonated during the night shift change when the mines would be relatively empty of adult workers. The cave-in and flooding proceeded exactly as the company had planned, except for one thing. Several dozen children who were supposed to have been working in the deepest parts of the mines had been moved to safety by a supervisor who had become suspicious of the company's activities. According to Ruth's research, the supervisor who saved the children was named Carl Magnuson, and he had been a friend of Thomas Anderson. After Thomas's death, Carl had found the hidden letters and realized what the company was planning. On the night of the cave-in, he had violated orders and evacuated all the child workers from the dangerous sections before the explosives were detonated. The company's story was that only horses and mules died in the cave-in, but that was not true, Ruth said. At least 23 children died that night trapped in areas that flooded too quickly for them to escape. Their bodies were never recovered because the company made no effort to look for them. As far as the official records were concerned, these children had never existed. Carl Magnuson had tried to report the truth about the cave-in to federal authorities, but he met the same fate as Thomas Anderson. He was found dead in a mining accident just 3 weeks after the disaster, crushed by equipment that had supposedly malfunctioned while he was working alone. The children who survived the cave-in were scattered to other mining operations throughout Alaska, Ruth continued. They were threatened with death if they ever talked about what they had experienced at Treadwell, and most of them were too traumatized to speak about it anyway. But one of those children was a 10-year-old boy named Eric Anderson, Thomas Anderson's grandson, who had been sent to Treadwell after his parents died in a Seattle fire. Ruth paused to wipe away tears before continuing. Eric Anderson was my grandfather. He survived the Treadwell cave-in because Carl Magnuson pulled him out of the flooded sections, but he spent the rest of his life haunted by the memories of the children who died down there. He could hear them in his dreams, calling for help from under the water. That is why I have never wanted to visit the Treadwell ruins. Those children are still down there, and they are still calling for someone to tell their story. David had stopped recording and was staring at his grandmother in shock. Do you have any proof of these allegations beyond Thomas's letters? Ruth reached into her purse one more time and pulled out a small metal object. This was Eric's identification tag from the Treadwell Mining Company. Child workers were required to wear them so their bodies could be identified if they died in accidents. Eric kept it his entire life as a reminder of the friends he lost in the cave-in. The tag was stamped with Treadwell Mines, Child Worker 247, E. Anderson, 1917. The company claimed they never used child labor, Ruth said. But they kept records, just like they kept records of everything else. These identification tags were proof of their crimes, which is why they were so desperate to bury the evidence under millions of tons of seawater. Ruth's revelations cast the Treadwell mine disaster in an entirely new light. The cave-in that historians had always described as a tragic but natural geological failure had actually been a carefully orchestrated mass murder designed to cover up decades of child exploitation and kill the witnesses who could expose the company's crimes. After the cave-in, the Treadwell Company collected over $2 million in insurance payments, Ruth concluded. They used that money to expand their operations in other countries, where labor laws were even less strictly enforced. The children who died in the flooded mines were forgotten, their names erased from all records, their families told they had run away or been transferred to other facilities. David asked his grandmother if she had ever considered making this information public. Ruth shook her head. Who would believe it? And what good would it do now? The people responsible are long dead, and the company dissolved decades ago. But I wanted you to know the truth about our family history, and about why some places should be left undisturbed. Those children are still down there in the flooded mines, and they deserve to rest in peace. As the Henderson family sat in stunned silence processing Ruth's revelations, David found himself thinking about all the tourists who visited the Treadwell ruins every year, taking photographs and admiring the scenic views across Gastineau Channel. None of them knew they were walking above a mass grave, or that the picturesque ruins marked the site of one of the most heinous corporate crimes in American history. Ruth Henderson died peacefully in her sleep 6 months later, taking with her the weight of a family secret that had been passed down through 4 generations. But she had fulfilled her promise to her grandfather Eric, ensuring that someone would finally know the truth about the children who had died in the Treadwell mines. The Henderson family never did visit the Treadwell ruins during their reunions, but sometimes, on quiet summer evenings when the wind was blowing across Gastineau Channel, David Henderson thought he could hear something carrying across the water from Douglas Island, the sound of children calling from deep beneath their flooded ruins, still waiting for someone to bring them home. Jake Morrison was just trying to make ends meet when he took the demolition job at the Buckner building in 2018. The city said they needed preliminary work done. They did not mention what they expected him to find. Jake had been working construction in Alaska for 15 years, specializing in hazardous material removal from abandoned buildings. The pay was decent, and he was comfortable dealing with asbestos, lead paint, and the occasional structural hazard. When the city of Whittier contacted him about doing preliminary assessment work on the infamous Buckner building, he thought it would be just another routine job. The Buckner building had been an imposing presence in Whittier since 1953, when the U.S. Army completed construction on what was then called the City Under One Roof. 6 stories tall, nearly 500 feet long, and containing approximately 275,000 square feet of floor space, it had housed over 1,000 military personnel and their families during the height of the Cold War. After the military abandoned the facility in 1960, the building had been slowly deteriorating for nearly 6 decades. Jake's initial contract was straightforward: conduct a structural assessment of the building's lower levels, document hazardous materials, and prepare cost estimates for eventual demolition. The city had finally decided to tear down the eyesore and use the valuable waterfront land for development projects. What should have been a 2-week job turned into something that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. The first sign that something was wrong came during his initial walkthrough of the building's basement levels. Jake had been told that the lower floors were flooded due to decades of weather damage and poor drainage, but what he found was far more disturbing. The water in the basement was not stagnant rainwater or melted snow. It was circulating, as if being pumped through some kind of filtration system. The water was crystal clear, Jake later told investigators. It should have been filthy after sitting in a concrete basement for 60 years. Instead, it looked like it was being actively maintained. There were even lights underwater in some sections, dim but definitely functional. When I tested the electrical systems, they were supposed to be dead, but someone was still paying to keep certain circuits active. Jake documented his findings with photographs and sent a preliminary report to the city, expecting them to investigate the mysterious utility connections. Instead, he received a phone call from a man who identified himself as Dr. Richard Vasquez, a representative from the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. Dr. Vasquez told me that certain areas of the Buckner building contain classified materials left over from military operations, Jake recalled. He said that my contract had been expanded to include documentation and secure removal of these materials, and that I would be working with federal oversight from now on. The pay increase was substantial enough that I did not ask too many questions at first. But as Jake began exploring the building's restricted areas under Dr. Vasquez's direction, he discovered that the military had left behind far more than routine equipment or hazardous materials. Hidden behind false walls and sealed doorways, he found laboratories that appeared to have been abandoned in haste, with equipment still connected to power sources, and experiments that looked like they had been interrupted rather than properly concluded. The first lab I found was on the 3rd floor, in what used to be the building's medical facility, Jake explained. It was hidden behind a wall that had been constructed to look like part of the original building, but when you examined it closely, you could see it had been added later. Inside were examination tables with restraints, monitoring equipment that was still recording data, and tanks filled with what looked like preservation fluid. Dr. Vasquez told me this was biological research equipment left over from Cold War medical experiments, and that it needed to be carefully documented before removal. Jake spent 3 days photographing and cataloging the contents of the hidden laboratory before Dr. Vasquez arrived with a team of federal agents to supervise the removal of what he called sensitive materials. But Jake had been in construction long enough to recognize when something was not right, and the equipment being removed from the lab did not look like it was 60 years old. The monitoring devices were digital, Jake said. They had LCD displays and USB ports. Some of the computers were running modern operating systems. When I mentioned this to Dr. Vasquez, he told me that the equipment had been upgraded over the years for security purposes. and that I should focus on my job rather than asking questions about things that did not concern me. But Jake Morrison was not the kind of man who ignored his instincts when something felt wrong. After the federal team finished removing equipment from the first laboratory, he began exploring other areas of the building on his own time, looking for more hidden spaces. What he found in the basement levels would change his understanding of everything he thought he knew about the Buckner building. There was an entire floor that did not appear on any of the building's original blueprints, Jake revealed. You could only access it through a service elevator that required a special key card to operate. I managed to get the elevator working using some electrical bypasses, and when I got down there, I found a facility that was clearly still in use. Fresh air circulation, clean water, recent food supplies, and laboratories that looked like they belonged in a modern research hospital. The underground facility contained dozens of rooms connected by sterile corridors that were maintained at precise temperatures and humidity levels. Jake found sleeping quarters that showed signs of recent occupation, conference rooms with whiteboards covered in complex formulas and diagrams, and what appeared to be a central computer system that was actively monitoring dozens of different experiments. The most disturbing thing was the observation rooms, Jake said. They had one-way mirrors looking into chambers that were clearly designed to hold human subjects. Some of the chambers had medical equipment attached, IV lines, monitoring devices, machines I could not identify. There were logbooks documenting experiments going back to the 1960s, but also entries from recent years. Whatever the military had been doing in that building, it did not stop when they officially closed the base in 1960. Jake photographed everything he could find in the underground facility, but when he tried to upload the images to his cloud storage account, he discovered that his internet access had been blocked. His cell phone service was also mysteriously unavailable whenever he was inside the building, even though it worked perfectly everywhere else in Whittier. I realized I was being monitored, Jake explained. There were cameras in every room I had explored, and someone was actively controlling access to communications from inside the building. When I tried to leave through the main entrance, I found that the doors had been locked electronically, and the keypad required a code I did not have. I was essentially trapped inside the Buckner building with evidence of ongoing illegal human experimentation. Jake spent 2 days trying to find a way out of the building while avoiding the areas where he suspected he might encounter whoever was maintaining the underground facility. He eventually managed to escape through a damaged section of the building's exterior wall, but not before making one final discovery that would haunt him for years to come. On my way out, I found the morgue, Jake said. It was in the basement level, connected to the underground laboratory complex. There were bodies in the freezer units, some of them recent enough that they could not have been there since 1960. The identification tags showed names and dates from the past few years, and many of them were people who had been reported missing from communities throughout Alaska. I photographed as many of the tags as I could before I got out of there. After escaping from the Buckner building, Jake immediately contacted the Alaska State Police and the FBI to report what he had found. But when investigators arrived at the building the following day, they found that the underground facility had been completely cleaned out. The hidden laboratories were empty, the computer systems had been removed, and the morgue was spotless. Dr. Vasquez called me that evening and told me that I had been the victim of an elaborate hoax, Jake recalled. He said that urban explorers had been using the abandoned building to stage fake horror scenarios, and that what I thought were real laboratories had actually been movie sets left behind by filmmakers. He offered me a substantial bonus payment for the work I had completed, along with a confidentiality agreement that prohibited me from discussing my experiences in the building. But Jake Morrison knew the difference between movie props and real medical equipment. He refused to sign the confidentiality agreement and instead began investigating the true history of the Buckner building and the military experiments that had been conducted there during the Cold War. I found records showing that the Army had been conducting psychological warfare research at the Whittier facility from 1953 until at least 1975, Jake explained. They were testing methods of mind control, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation that could be used against enemy prisoners or defectors. The experiments were part of a classified program that involved multiple military installations throughout Alaska. Jake's research revealed that the psychological warfare program had never been officially terminated, but had instead been transferred to civilian contractors who continued the work under different funding mechanisms. The Buckner building had been maintained as an active research facility for over 60 years, hidden in plain sight as an abandoned military installation. The reason the city wanted to demolish the building was not because it was an eyesore, Jake concluded. It was because local officials had finally learned about the ongoing experiments and wanted to eliminate the evidence before it became public. My job was never about demolition. It was about documenting what needed to be removed before the building was destroyed. Jake Morrison submitted his findings to multiple government agencies, news organizations, and human rights groups. Most ignored his reports, dismissing them as conspiracy theories or the fantasies of someone who'd been exposed to too many toxic fumes in abandoned buildings. But a few investigators began looking into the disappearances that Jake had documented, and patterns began to emerge. Over the past 20 years, more than 40 people have gone missing from communities within a 100-mile radius of Whittier, Jake discovered. Most were transients, homeless individuals, or people without strong family connections who would not be missed immediately. The disappearances were spread out over time and across different jurisdictions, so no one ever connected them to a single location or organization. The Alaska State Police eventually opened an investigation into the missing persons cases, but their inquiries into the Buckner building were blocked by federal authorities who claimed the facility contained classified materials that could not be examined without proper security clearances. The building remains standing today, surrounded by new fencing and security cameras that were installed shortly after Jake Morrison's discoveries. "I know what I saw in that building," Jake concluded. "There are still people being held in underground facilities throughout Alaska, and the Buckner building is just one location in a network of sites where illegal human experimentation continues under government protection. The Cold War may have ended, but the programs that were developed during that time have been expanded and refined using modern technology." Jake Morrison moved away from Alaska in 2019, but he continues to investigate military experimentation programs and advocate for the families of missing persons who may have been victims of these operations. He has documented similar facilities at other abandoned military installations throughout the United States, suggesting that the Buckner building represents just one piece of a much larger and more disturbing pattern of government-sponsored human rights violations. "The most terrifying thing about the Buckner building is not what happened there in the past," Jake warned. "It is what is still happening there today, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and classification levels that prevent anyone from asking the right questions or demanding accountability. These programs continue because people in power have decided that certain lives are expendable in the name of national security. The Buckner building remains a monument to the dark side of American military ambition, a concrete testament to the human cost of experiments that should never have been conducted. And according to Jake Morrison, it continues to serve its original purpose, not as housing for soldiers, but as a laboratory where the limits of human endurance are tested by people who have forgotten that their subjects were once someone's children, parents, and friends. Today, tourists visiting Whittier often photograph the imposing structure, admiring its brutalist architecture and imagining what life must have been like in the military's city under one roof. But if Jake Morrison is right, they are not looking at an abandoned relic of the Cold War. They are looking at an active crime scene where horrors continue to unfold in the shadows, hidden from the world by concrete walls and government secrecy. When DNA testing connected Amy Kanakaratok to relatives in King Island, she was thrilled. But her excitement turned to horror when she learned why her great-grandmother never spoke about the village of Ukivak. What Amy discovered through her genealogy research would reveal a government conspiracy so callous and deliberate that it had erased an entire community from existence, leaving behind only empty houses, clinging to cliffs, and the ghosts of cultural genocide. Amy Kanakaratok had always known she was Inupiat, but her family history had been fragmented by generations of silence and painful memories that her elders refused to discuss. When she submitted her DNA sample to Ancestry DNA in 2019, she was hoping to connect with distant relatives and perhaps fill in some of the gaps in her family tree. She never expected to uncover a story that would fundamentally change her understanding of her family's past and reveal one of the most systematic and cruel acts of cultural destruction in Alaskan history. The DNA results showed strong connections to people with surnames like Yatunguk, Pikungana, and Pushruk, names that Amy had never heard before but that seemed to call to something deep in her genetic memory. When she reached out to her matches, she learned that they were descendants of people who had lived on a remote island in the Bering Sea called Ukivak, or King Island, in a village known as Ukivak. I had never heard of King Island or Ukivak, Amy explained. When I asked my grandmother about it, she just looked at me with this expression of pure pain and said, "That is a place we do not talk about. Some wounds are too deep to ever heal." But I could not let it go. The DNA connections were too strong, and I needed to understand why my family had buried this part of our history so completely. Amy began researching Ukivak and discovered that it had been a remarkable community, a village built on stilts against the steep cliffs of King Island, where Inupiat families had lived for centuries in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The Ukivok Mute, as they called themselves, were master hunters and craftsmen who had adapted to life on a rocky island where survival required incredible skill and cooperation. But Amy also learned that Ukivak had been abandoned in the late 1960s, with the entire population relocated to mainland Alaska communities. The official explanation was that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had closed the village school in 1959 due to safety concerns about a large boulder that threatened to fall on the building, and that families had chosen to move to the mainland to ensure their children could receive an education. The official story made it sound like a reasonable decision, Amy said. But when I started talking to other descendants of Ukivak residents, I began to hear a very different version of events. People told me about children being taken away in the middle of the night, about families being threatened with the loss of government benefits if they refused to relocate, about a community being systematically destroyed by people who saw their way of life as an obstacle to progress. Amy's breakthrough came when she connected with Eleanor Pushruk, an elderly woman in Nome who had been born in Ukivak in 1943. Eleanor had spent her entire life trying to forget her childhood experiences, but when Amy explained her family connections, Eleanor finally agreed to share what she remembered about the destruction of their community. Eleanor told me that the school closure was not about safety, Amy revealed. It was about forcing the Ukivok Mute to abandon their traditional lifestyle and assimilate into Western society. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had been planning to close isolated native villages throughout Alaska as part of what they called a modernization initiative. Ukivak was chosen as a test case because it was so remote that no one would pay attention to what happened there. According to Eleanor's account, federal agents had visited Ukivak in 1958 and informed community leaders that their children would no longer be allowed to receive education on the island. The agents claimed that the one-room school was inadequate and that native children needed to be educated in modern facilities on the mainland, where they could learn to function in American society. Eleanor said that when the elders protested and pointed out that their children were already receiving education in both English and Inupiaq. They were told that traditional native education was not recognized by the federal government, Amy continued. The agents made it clear that families who refused to send their children to mainland schools would lose access to government services, including medical care and food assistance programs that many families had become dependent on. But the true scope of the conspiracy became clear when Amy discovered government documents that had been declassified in the 1990s as part of congressional investigations into federal policies toward Alaska Natives. The documents revealed that the closure of Ukivak was part of a broader program called the Alaska Native Settlement Initiative, which aimed to concentrate Alaska Native populations in designated communities where they could be more easily supervised and controlled. The documents were horrifying, Amy explained. There were memos discussing the most efficient methods for breaking up traditional Native communities, strategies for overcoming resistance from elders, and cost-benefit analyses of forced relocation programs. The bureaucrats who designed these policies talked about Alaska Native families like they were livestock being moved to more convenient pastures. One particularly disturbing memo, dated March 1959, discussed the Ukivak closure specifically. The King Island community represents an ideal test case for our relocation protocols. The isolation of the village makes it unlikely that media attention will focus on the transition process, and the small population size will allow us to monitor the effectiveness of our psychological pressure techniques. If successful, the Ukivak model can be applied to other resistant communities throughout rural Alaska. Amy learned that the psychological pressure techniques had included withholding medical supplies from the island, cutting off mail service, and spreading rumors among mainland communities that the Ukivakmiut were carriers of infectious diseases. When some families initially refused to relocate, their children were removed by federal agents and placed in boarding schools hundreds of miles away, with parents told that they could only visit their children if they permanently relocated to approved communities. Eleanor told me about the night they came for the children, Amy said, her voice breaking. Federal agents arrived on a Coast Guard cutter in the middle of a storm, claiming they were conducting a medical emergency evacuation. They rounded up all the children over the age of 6 and loaded them onto the ship. Parents who tried to resist were told that they were interfering with federal agents and would be arrested. The children were crying and screaming for their parents, and the parents were crying and screaming for their children, but the agents just ignored them all. The children who were taken from Ukivak were dispersed to boarding schools throughout Alaska and the continental United States, where they were forbidden to speak Inupiaq and were punished for practicing any traditional behaviors. Many of them never saw their parents again, as the trauma of separation and the systematic destruction of their cultural identity made it impossible for families to maintain connections across the vast distances. Eleanor was one of those children, Amy revealed. She was 7 years old when they took her to a boarding school in Sitka. She told me that for the first year she cried herself to sleep every night, believing that her parents would come to take her home, but after a while, the school administrators convinced her that her parents had abandoned her by choice, that they cared more about their primitive way of life than about giving her opportunities for education and advancement. The psychological manipulation of the children was deliberate and systematic. They were told that their parents were backwards and ignorant, that their traditional culture was holding them back from success in the modern world, and that they should be grateful to the government for rescuing them from lives of poverty and isolation. Many of the children eventually came to believe these messages, creating a generation of Alaska Natives who were ashamed of their heritage and unable to return to their communities even after they became adults. Meanwhile, the adults who remained in Ukivak found it increasingly difficult to maintain their traditional subsistence lifestyle without their children and younger adults. The village population dwindled as families gradually relocated to mainland communities, until by 1970, The island was completely abandoned. The cruelest part was that the boulder they claimed was going to destroy the school never fell, Amy said. Eleanor told me that when some of the former residents visited the island in the 1980s, the boulder was still sitting in exactly the same place, and the school building was still standing. The whole safety story was a lie designed to provide legal justification for what was essentially cultural genocide. Amy's research revealed that similar tactics had been used to force the abandonment of dozens of traditional Alaska Native communities throughout the 1950s and 1960s. In each case, federal agencies had manufactured crises or safety concerns that required immediate relocation, then systematically destroyed the social and economic foundations that allowed these communities to survive. The pattern was always the same, Amy explained. First, they would cut off essential services to make life in the village more difficult. Then, they would remove the children under some pretext, breaking the emotional bonds that held communities together. Finally, they would offer relocation assistance to families who agreed to move voluntarily, while making it clear that those who refused would lose access to government benefits and face legal consequences. The long-term effects of this systematic cultural destruction continue to impact Alaska Native communities today. Many families, like Amy's, lost connections to their traditional homelands and struggled with intergenerational trauma that was never acknowledged or addressed by the government agencies responsible for the forced relocations. Eleanor told me that she had nightmares about Ukivak for decades after she left, Amy said. She could see the village in her dreams, the houses on stilts, the sound of the ocean, the faces of the elders she would never see again. But she also told me that she had been afraid to talk about these memories because she had been taught to believe that missing her traditional life was a sign of weakness or failure to adapt. Amy's genealogy search had begun as an attempt to connect with her family history, but it became a journey of cultural recovery and healing. She organized a gathering of Ukivak descendants in 2020, bringing together people who had been scattered across Alaska and the continental United States for over 50 years. When we all met for the first time, there were people who looked at each other and immediately recognized family resemblances, even though they had never met before, Amy recalled. Eleanor looked at one man and said, "You have your grandfather's eyes." Even though his grandfather had died in Ukivak 60 years earlier, the genetic connections were still there, even though the cultural connections had been deliberately severed. The gathering became an opportunity for elderly Ukivak descendants to share memories and stories that they had kept buried for decades, and for younger generations to learn about their heritage that had been hidden from them. But it also became a forum for discussing the ongoing effects of the forced relocation and the ways that government policies continue to impact Alaska Native communities. We realized that what happened to Ukivak was not ancient history, Amy explained. The same agencies that destroyed our village are still making decisions about Alaska Native communities today, and they are still operating under the assumption that traditional Native lifestyles are obstacles to progress that need to be eliminated. Until we acknowledge what was done to places like Ukivak, we cannot prevent it from happening again. Amy Kanakaratak's genealogy search had uncovered more than family connections. It had revealed a deliberate campaign of cultural destruction that had been hidden from public view for over 60 years. The empty houses of Ukivak, still clinging to their clifftop perches, stand as monuments to a community that refused to disappear completely, preserved in the memories and DNA of descendants who are finally ready to tell their story. Every time I look at my DNA matches, I see the names of people who should have grown up in Ukivak, who should have learned to hunt walrus and gather seabird eggs, who should have spoken Inupiaq as their first language, Amy concluded. Instead, they were scattered across the continent and taught to forget who they were. But DNA does not lie, and neither do the stories of the elders who survived. Ukivak may be a ghost town, but the Ukivak Mute are still here, and we will not let our history be buried forever. The story of Ukivak serves as a reminder that ghost towns are not always created by economic forces or natural disasters. Sometimes they are the result of deliberate policies designed to erase entire ways of life from existence. But it also demonstrates the resilience of communities that refuse to be forgotten, even when powerful forces conspire to make them disappear. The earthquake photographs were supposed to be routine disaster documentation, but when curator Diana Walsh was preparing the 1964 Portage exhibit, she noticed something in the background of several photos that made her blood run cold. What she discovered would reveal that the most devastating earthquake in North American history had been preceded by supernatural activity so disturbing that government officials had spent decades covering up the evidence. Diana Walsh had been working as a curator for the Alaska Historical Society for 12 years when she was assigned to organize a 50th anniversary exhibition commemorating the Great Alaska Earthquake of March 27, 1964. The 9.2 magnitude quake had been the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in North America, destroying entire communities and killing 131 people. The town of Portage, located in the Turnagain Arm area south of Anchorage, had been completely destroyed and subsequently abandoned, becoming one of Alaska's most famous ghost towns. Diana's job was to curate photographs, documents, and artifacts that would tell the story of the earthquake's impact on Alaskan communities. She had access to thousands of images from government archives, newspaper collections, and private donations, aerial shots of damaged buildings, rescue operations, and the geological aftermath of the disaster. Most of the photographs were straightforward documentary images that captured the earthquake's destructive power in stark detail. But as Diana worked through the collection, she began to notice anomalies in certain photographs that had been taken in the days and weeks before the earthquake struck. These images, originally intended to document ordinary life in Portage and other affected communities, contained details in the background that seemed impossible to explain through conventional means. The first unusual photograph came from the collection of Robert Hendricks, a freelance photographer who had been documenting life in small Alaskan communities during the winter of 1963 to 64, Diana explained. The image showed children playing in the snow outside the Portage post office on March 20th, exactly 1 week before the earthquake. But when I examined the photograph closely, I could see what appeared to be cracks in the ground behind the children, cracks that formed geometric patterns that looked almost like symbols or writing. Diana initially assumed the patterns were photographic artifacts or shadows created by unusual lighting conditions. But when she found similar geometric ground disturbances in photographs taken in other communities that would later be affected by the earthquake, she began to suspect that something more significant was happening. I found 12 different photographs taken between March 10th and March 26th, 1964, in communities throughout south-central Alaska, Diana continued. All of them showed the same type of ground patterns, intricate geometric designs that appeared to have been formed naturally in snow, ice, or bare earth. The patterns were always located near buildings or infrastructure that would later suffer severe earthquake damage. Diana contacted Dr. James Morrison, a geology professor at the University of Alaska Anchorage, hoping he could provide a scientific explanation for the ground disturbances. But Dr. Morrison's analysis only deepened the mystery. Dr. Morrison told me that the patterns in the photographs could not have been created by any known geological processes, Diana revealed. The geometric precision was too perfect, and the timing was too consistent. He said that if these formations had actually existed before the earthquake, they would represent a type of pre-seismic phenomena that had never been documented in scientific literature. But the ground patterns were not the most disturbing discovery Diana made while preparing the exhibition, As she continued examining photographs, she began to notice human figures that appeared in multiple images but seemed to defy logical explanation. There was a series of photographs taken by different photographers in different locations on different days, but they all contained the same group of people standing in the background, Diana explained. These individuals were always positioned near the geometric ground patterns, and they appeared to be observing or measuring the formations. But when I tried to identify these people through government employment records or local community directories, I could find no trace of them anywhere. The mysterious figures appeared in photographs taken in Portage, Anchorage, Seward, and Valdez, communities separated by hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. Given the transportation limitations of rural Alaska in 1964, it would have been virtually impossible for the same group of people to appear in all these locations within the span of 2 weeks. The most unsettling thing about these figures was that they seemed to be anticipating the earthquake, Diana continued. In every photograph, they were positioned in areas that would later experience the most severe damage, and they appeared to be documenting or studying something that regular residents of these communities could not see. Diana's investigation took a dramatic turn when she received a phone call from Margaret Jensen, an elderly woman in Palmer who had seen a newspaper article about the earthquake anniversary exhibition. Margaret claimed to have information about the mysterious figures that Diana had been unable to identify. Margaret told me that her late husband, Carl Jensen, had been a surveyor working for the Alaska Department of Transportation in 1964, Diana explained. According to Margaret, Carl had encountered the same group of people while conducting routine road surveys in the weeks before the earthquake. But these people had not been conducting any official government business, and they had been using equipment that Carl did not recognize. Carl Jensen had documented his encounters with the mysterious survey team in his work journals, which Margaret had preserved after his death in 1987. When Diana examined these journals, she found entries that corroborated what she had observed in the photographs. March 18, 1964, Diana read from Carl's journal. Encountered the federal team again near mile 78 of the Seward Highway. They were using some kind of ground-penetrating equipment that looked more advanced than anything our department has access to. When I approached them to ask about their project authorization, they showed me credentials from an agency I had never heard of, something called the Geological Anomaly Research Division. They told me they were conducting classified studies related to national security and that I should not include their activities in my official reports. Carl's journal entries revealed that the mysterious survey team had been active throughout south-central Alaska for several months before the earthquake, always focusing on areas that would later experience severe seismic damage. They had sophisticated equipment for measuring ground vibrations, electromagnetic fields, and other phenomena that seemed far beyond the capabilities of standard geological survey teams in 1964. March 24, 1964, Diana continued reading. The federal team was at the Portage Flats today, setting up monitoring equipment in a grid pattern that covered most of the town site. Their team leader, a man who identified himself only as Dr. Coleman, told me that they were expecting significant geological activity in the area within the next few days. When I asked him to be more specific, he said that some information was classified, but that local residents should be prepared for emergency evacuations. Carl Jensen's final journal entry about the mysterious survey team was dated March 26, 1964, just 1 day before the earthquake struck. March 26, 1964, Diana read, Dr. Coleman and his team have packed up their equipment and left the area. Before departing, Dr. Coleman approached me and said that their work was complete and that natural processes would take their course within the next 24 hours. He seemed to know exactly what was going to happen, but when I pressed him for details, he told me that some knowledge was too dangerous to share with civilians. Diana contacted the U.S. Geological Survey and other federal agencies to inquire about the Geological Anomaly Research Division, but no agency had any record of such an organization. When she requested access to classified files related to earthquake prediction research in the 1960s, she was told that many relevant documents had been destroyed or were still classified for national security reasons. I spent months trying to track down any official record of Dr. Coleman and his survey team, Diana explained, but it was as if they had never existed in any official capacity. The only evidence of their activities was the photographs I had found and Carl Jensen's journal entries. Diana's investigation reached a breakthrough when she received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Richard Saunders, a retired seismologist who had worked for the Air Force's Arctic Aeromedical Laboratory in the 1960s. Dr. Saunders had read about Diana's research in a scientific journal and wanted to share information that he had been forbidden to discuss for over 50 years. Dr. Saunders told me that the military had been conducting classified earthquake prediction experiments in Alaska since the late 1950s, Diana revealed. The research was part of a broader program to investigate whether seismic activity could be artificially triggered or predicted using advanced electromagnetic and ionospheric monitoring techniques. According to Dr. Saunders, the Geological Anomaly Research Division had been a cover organization for military scientists who were testing experimental earthquake prediction methods throughout Alaska. The geometric ground patterns that Diana had observed in the photographs were actually electromagnetic signatures created by underground monitoring equipment that had been secretly installed in areas of high seismic risk. Dr. Saunders explained that the military had developed technology that could detect precursor signals indicating when and where major earthquakes were likely to occur, Diana continued. The survey teams were deployed to areas where their computers had predicted seismic activity, and they were gathering data to refine their prediction algorithms. But Dr. Saunders also revealed that the earthquake prediction program had achieved far more success than anyone had expected, and that this success had created ethical and political problems that led to the program's termination and cover-up. Dr. Saunders told me that the military's earthquake prediction system had accurately forecast the March 27th earthquake at least 2 weeks in advance, Diana explained. They knew exactly when and where it would strike, and they knew approximately how powerful it would be. But they made a conscious decision not to warn civilian authorities or evacuate threatened communities. The decision to withhold earthquake warnings from civilian populations had been made at the highest levels of military command based on concerns that public knowledge of earthquake prediction capabilities would create panic and could potentially be exploited by enemy nations as a form of seismic warfare. Dr. Saunders said that there had been intense debates within the military about whether to issue warnings before the 1964 earthquake, Diana continued. Some scientists argued that they had a moral obligation to save lives, but they were overruled by officials who believed that maintaining the secrecy of their research capabilities was more important than protecting civilians. The cover-up of the earthquake prediction program had extended to the systematic removal of evidence from official records and the suppression of eyewitness accounts that might reveal the existence of pre-earthquake monitoring activities. Photographers who had captured images of the mysterious survey teams were contacted by government agents and asked to surrender their film for national security reasons. Dr. Saunders told me that most of the photographers had cooperated with the government requests, but some images had survived in private collections or had been overlooked during the evidence collection process, Diana explained. The photographs I had found for the exhibition were probably the only remaining visual evidence of the secret earthquake prediction program. Diana faced a difficult decision about whether to include her discoveries in the earthquake anniversary exhibition. The evidence she had uncovered suggested that the U.S. military had possessed advanced knowledge of one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history, but had chosen to let it proceed without warning the affected communities. I consulted with the Historical Society's board of directors and legal counsel about whether we could ethically display this information to the public, Diana explained. But I was told that making accusations against federal agencies without definitive proof could result in lawsuits and loss of government funding for our organization. Ultimately, Diana decided to include some of the unusual photographs in the exhibition, but without detailed explanations of their potential significance. Visitors to the exhibition were able to see the geometric ground patterns and mysterious figures, but they were not told about the possible connections to secret military earthquake prediction research. I compromised by including the photographs with neutral captions that invited viewers to draw their own conclusions, Diana said. But I also prepared a detailed research report documenting everything I had discovered, and I deposited copies in multiple archives to ensure that the information would be preserved for future researchers. The Earthquake Anniversary exhibition opened to great public interest, but Diana noticed that several individuals who attended the opening appeared to be taking extensive notes and photographs of the unusual images she had displayed. When she tried to approach these individuals to ask about their interest in the exhibition, they left abruptly without identifying themselves. 2 weeks after the exhibition opened, I received a phone call from someone who identified himself as a representative of the Department of Defense, Diana revealed. He told me that some of the photographs in the exhibition contained sensitive information related to ongoing national security research, and he requested that I remove them from public display. Diana refused to remove the photographs, arguing that they were part of the historical record and had been obtained through legitimate research channels. But she began to experience harassment and intimidation that suggested powerful forces were determined to suppress the information she had uncovered. My office was broken into 3 times over the next month, but nothing was stolen except files related to my earthquake research, Diana explained. I also received anonymous phone calls warning me to stop investigating government activities or face serious consequences. The pressure campaign against Diana escalated when the Alaska Historical Society's board of directors suddenly voted to close the earthquake exhibition early and transfer the controversial photographs to a restricted archive where they would not be available for public viewing. I was told that the board had received complaints from federal agencies about the exhibition's content, and that continued display of the photographs could jeopardize the organization's tax-exempt status, Diana said. But I knew that the real issue was that I had uncovered evidence of a government cover-up, and powerful people were determined to keep that information hidden. Diana Walsh left her position at the Alaska Historical Society in 2015, but she continues to research the connections between government earthquake prediction programs and the 1964 Alaska earthquake. Her work has inspired other researchers to investigate similar patterns of unusual pre-disaster activity in other regions affected by major seismic events. The photographs I found proved that the government knew the 1964 earthquake was coming and chose to let it happen, Diana concluded. More than 130 people died because officials decided that protecting military secrets was more important than protecting human lives. That decision turned Portage and other communities into ghost towns that could have been saved if the truth had been told. The abandoned ruins of Portage still attract thousands of visitors each year, most of whom see only the dramatic evidence of earthquake damage preserved in tilted buildings and salt-killed forests. But Diana Walsh's research suggests that these ghost town remnants also represent evidence of a government conspiracy that allowed natural disasters to proceed unimpeded in order to protect classified research programs that treated human lives as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of military advantage. Jake had over 50,000 followers on his wilderness blog. His posts from Prince of Wales Island were supposed to showcase Sulzer's remote beauty. Instead, they documented his final 72 hours. What started as routine hiking documentation became a real-time record of supernatural terror that ended with Jake's mysterious disappearance and the discovery that some abandoned mining towns are guarded by forces that never left. Jake Peterson had been running his wilderness blog, Alaska Untamed, for 7 years when he decided to explore the abandoned mining settlement of Sulzer on Prince of Wales Island. At 32, he was an experienced backcountry hiker who specialized in documenting Alaska's forgotten places, combining stunning photography with detailed historical research that made his posts educational as well as entertaining. Jake's followers loved his approach to storytelling through social media, daily Instagram posts, Twitter updates from remote locations, and detailed blog entries that brought Alaska's ghost towns to life through his personal experiences. When he announced his plan to spend a week exploring Sulzer and the surrounding mining claims, hundreds of followers responded with excitement and encouragement. Day 1, March 8th, 2023, Jake posted on his blog that evening. Made it to Sulzer after a brutal 8-hour hike from the Hollis ferry terminal. This place is incredible and incredibly isolated. The mining camp was abandoned in the 1940s, but the structures are in amazing condition considering they have been sitting in the rainforest for 80 years. Planning to document the main buildings tomorrow and then explore some of the mining claims higher up the mountain. Jake's first Instagram post from Sulzer showed the settlement's main lodge, a massive log building that had served as both a headquarters and accommodation for the mining operations management staff. The photograph captured the eerie beauty of the structure, with moss-covered logs and broken windows that seemed to glow in the filtered light of the coastal forest. But even in that first post, some of Jake's followers noticed something unsettling in the background of the photograph. Behind the lodge, barely visible through the trees, was what appeared to be a human figure standing motionless near one of the abandoned mining buildings. Day 2, March 9th. Jake's blog post began. Woke up to the strangest feeling that I was being watched. Set up my tent about 100 yards from the main settlement, but I could swear I heard movement around the buildings all night. Probably just wildlife, but the acoustics in this forest are weird. Sounds carry in ways that make it impossible to tell where they're coming from. Jake's Instagram posts from his second day showed detailed photographs of the mining equipment that had been left behind when the operation closed. Massive steam shovels, ore carts, and processing machinery sat exactly where they had been abandoned, as if the workers had simply walked away in the middle of a shift and never returned. But as Jake continued photographing the equipment, he began to notice that some of it appeared to have been moved recently. Fresh gouges in the forest floor showed where heavy machinery had been repositioned, and there were signs that someone had been maintaining the equipment, oiled gears, cleaned surfaces, and replaced parts that should have rusted away decades ago. The mining equipment here is in way too good condition for something that has been sitting in a temperate rainforest for 80 years, Jake posted on Twitter that afternoon. Either someone has been maintaining this stuff, or the stories about Sulzer being haunted are more literal than I thought. Starting to feel like I am not alone out here. Jake's followers began responding with concern and suggestions that he leave the area, but Jake reassured them that he was just being overly cautious and that isolated places often created feelings of unease that were not based on any real danger. Day 3, March 10th. Jake's blog post was more detailed and increasingly unsettled. Something is definitely not right about this place. Last night, I heard the sound of machinery running. Not just any machinery, but the specific sound of mining equipment in operation. Steam hissing, metal grinding against metal, the rhythmic pounding of ore processing equipment. When I investigated this morning, I found fresh tailings piles that were not there yesterday, and the ground around the main processing plant showed signs of recent heavy equipment operation. Jake's Instagram posts from his third day included photographs of the fresh mining activity, but they also showed something more disturbing. In several images, Dark figures could be seen in the background, always positioned near the mining equipment but never clearly visible enough to identify. Getting some seriously weird vibes from this place, Jake tweeted that evening. Found what looks like a recent campsite near the mine office, complete with modern camping gear and food supplies. But whoever was here cleared out fast, left behind coffee that was still warm and a fire that was still smoldering, starting to think I should cut this trip short. But Jake's followers were fascinated by his documentation of the mysterious activity at Sulzer, and many encouraged him to continue investigating. The engagement on his posts had reached record levels, with thousands of comments and shares as people became invested in the unfolding mystery. Day 4, March 11th, Jake's blog post showed clear signs of stress and paranoia. I am not alone out here. There are people working the mines at Sulzer, and they have been watching me since I arrived. Last night, I saw lights moving through the mining complex, and this morning I found fresh boot prints leading from my campsite to the main processing plant. Someone came right up to my tent while I was sleeping and just stood there. Jake's Instagram posts from his 4th day were increasingly disturbing. The photographs showed mining equipment that was clearly in active use, with fresh excavations and ore processing activity that indicated a significant ongoing operation. But more unsettling were the human figures that appeared in the background of almost every image, shadowy forms that seemed to be watching Jake document their activities. Found something that has me seriously freaked out, Jake tweeted that afternoon, along with a photograph of a bulletin board inside the mine office. This board is covered with work schedules, safety notices, and production reports, all dated within the last month. Someone is running a full-scale mining operation out here, and they are using equipment that should have been scrapped decades ago. The bulletin board photograph went viral within hours, shared thousands of times as Jake's followers tried to make sense of what appeared to be evidence of illegal mining activity in a remote area of Alaska where no permits had been issued for decades. Day 5, March 12th, Jake's final blog post was brief and clearly written under extreme stress. They know I am documenting their operation, and they are not happy about it. Last night, someone dismantled my tent while I was inside it, working around me in complete silence while I pretended to be asleep. I could feel them moving around me, but when I opened my eyes, there was nothing there. This morning, all of my camera equipment was arranged in a perfect circle around my sleeping bag, like some kind of warning or threat. Jake's final Instagram post was uploaded at 3:47 p.m. on March 12th. The image showed the entrance to one of the main mine shafts, but the photograph was blurry and seemed to have been taken while Jake was moving quickly. The caption read, "Going underground to see what they are really doing down there. If something happens to me, tell the authorities about Sulzer. This is not an abandoned mine. It is an active operation, and whoever is running it does not want witnesses." Jake's Twitter account went silent after 4:15 p.m. that day, when his last tweet read, "Can hear them coming after me. Going dark. Will update when I can." When Jake failed to check in with his emergency contact after missing his scheduled departure date, Alaska state troopers organized a search and rescue operation. The search team that reached Sulzer on March 18th found Jake's abandoned campsite and all of his hiking equipment, but no sign of Jake himself. The search team reported that the mining equipment at Sulzer appeared to be in operational condition, which contradicted all previous assessments of the site as a long-abandoned facility, Alaska State Trooper Captain Maria Rodriguez explained in a press statement. However, there were no signs of recent mining activity, no evidence of current occupation, and no indication of what might have happened to the missing hiker. The search team's official report made no mention of the active mining operation that Jake had documented in his social media posts, despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of people had seen his photographs and videos of the ongoing activity. When we arrived at Sulzer, we found a typical abandoned mining site with equipment that had been deteriorating in place for decades, search team leader Robert Chen told reporters. There were no fresh tailings piles no recent excavations, and no signs that anyone had been conducting mining activities at the location. But Jake's followers were not satisfied with the official explanation. Many of them had downloaded and preserved his photographs and videos before his social media accounts were deactivated, and they continued to share evidence of the mining operation that Jake had documented. The authorities are lying about what they found at Sulzer, posted at Alaska Wilderness Truth, a Twitter account created by Jake's followers to preserve his documentation. Jake's photographs prove there was active mining happening, and now they are trying to cover it up. Something happened to Jake because he discovered something he was not supposed to see. The controversy surrounding Jake's disappearance intensified when an anonymous source provided Jake's followers with what appeared to be classified documents related to Sulzer and other abandoned mining sites throughout southeast Alaska. The leaked documents suggested that several abandoned mining operations were actually being used as cover for classified government activities, including rare earth mineral extraction, underground weapons storage, and experimental mining techniques that violated environmental protection laws. The Sulzer facility serves as a testing ground for extraction methods that cannot be legally conducted at permitted mining sites, one document allegedly stated. Civilian access to the area must be strictly controlled to prevent exposure of operational security protocols. Federal authorities denied the authenticity of the leaked documents and insisted that no government activities were taking place at Sulzer or any other abandoned mining sites in Alaska. But Jake's followers noted that the documents explained many of the anomalies that Jake had documented: the maintained equipment, the active mining signs, and the presence of people who seemed determined to avoid detection. Jake stumbled onto something he was not supposed to see, concluded wilderness blogger Sarah Martinez, who had collaborated with Jake on several previous expeditions. The evidence he documented proves that Sulzer is not abandoned. It is being used for something that requires complete secrecy. Jake's disappearance was not an accident or a random wilderness tragedy. He was silenced because he was about to expose the truth about what is really happening in Alaska's remote areas. The official search for Jake Peterson was suspended after 2 weeks, with authorities concluding that he had likely suffered a wilderness accident and that his body had been carried away by wildlife or swept into one of the area's many streams and rivers. But Jake's social media documentation of his final days at Sulzer continues to circulate online, preserved by followers who believe his posts provide evidence of government cover-ups and illegal activities in Alaska's abandoned mining areas. Jake's final posts show that he was being systematically intimidated and threatened by people who were determined to protect their secret operation, wrote investigative journalist Michael Torres in a detailed analysis of Jake's social media evidence. The psychological warfare tactics documented in his posts, the machinery sounds, the midnight tent dismantling, the surveillance, suggest that Jake encountered a sophisticated operation run by people with extensive training in intimidation and elimination of witnesses. Today, Sulzer remains officially closed to public access, with signs posted throughout the area warning of unstable mining structures and hazardous conditions. But hikers who have ignored the warnings and ventured into the area report finding evidence that supports Jake's documentation: fresh mining activity, maintained equipment, and signs of ongoing operations that contradict the site's status as an abandoned facility. Jake Peterson disappeared because he documented proof that the government is lying about what is happening in Alaska's remote areas, concluded his most dedicated followers. His blog posts and social media updates provide the only honest account of what is really going on at places like Sulzer, and that is why he had to be silenced. Jake's blog, Alaska Untamed, remains online as a memorial to his wilderness documentation work, but his final posts from Sulzer serve as a chilling reminder that some ghost towns are not as abandoned as they appear, and that those who venture too far into Alaska's forgotten places may discover secrets that powerful forces are willing to kill to protect. The mystery of Trailblazer. Jake's disappearance continues to attract attention from conspiracy theorists, wilderness enthusiasts, and investigative journalists who believe his social media documentation provides evidence of government activities that were never meant to be exposed to public scrutiny. Realtor Benjamin Torres specialized in remote Alaskan properties. When a mysterious buyer offered cash for the entire abandoned town of Chisana, he thought it was the deal of a lifetime. He was partially right. It was definitely the deal of his lifetime. What Benjamin discovered about his client's true identity and the dark history of cannibalism that still haunted Chisana would transform a routine real estate transaction into a nightmare that claimed his sanity and possibly his soul. Benjamin Torres had been selling remote Alaskan properties for 18 years when he received the most unusual inquiry of his career. The email came from someone identifying himself as Harrison Blackwood, representing a private investment group interested in purchasing the entire abandoned town of Chisana for cash. The offer was for $2.8 million, well above market value for what amounted to a collection of deteriorating buildings in one of Alaska's most isolated locations. I specialize in unique properties that other realtors would not touch, Benjamin explained. Ghost towns, abandoned mining claims, remote cabins with no road access. But I'd never had anyone offer to buy an entire town before, especially not one as remote and historically troubled as Chisana. Chisana had been a gold rush boomtown in the early 1900s, briefly becoming one of the largest settlements in Alaska when prospectors discovered rich placer deposits in the surrounding creeks. But the town's boom had been short-lived and marked by violence, starvation, and rumors of cannibalism that had given it a sinister reputation, even among hardened frontier communities. The town was basically abandoned by 1915 after the easily accessible gold played out and several particularly harsh winters killed off most of the remaining population, Benjamin continued. There had been various attempts to revive it over the decades, but something about Chisana seemed to drive people away. Most locals would not even talk about the place, and the few who had always warned me to stay away from it. Benjamin had been trying to sell various Chisana properties for years without success. The town's remote location, accessible only by small aircraft or a treacherous overland journey, made it impractical for most buyers. But Harrison Blackwood's investment group seemed unconcerned by the logistical challenges and was willing to pay premium prices for the isolation. Mr. Blackwood said his clients were interested in establishing a private retreat center where they could pursue their research without interference from government regulators or curious neighbors, Benjamin recalled. He was very specific about wanting complete privacy and emphasized that they needed a location with no nearby residents and no casual visitors. The initial negotiations proceeded smoothly. Blackwood provided proof of funds, submitted all required documentation, and seemed knowledgeable about Alaska real estate law. But as the transaction moved toward closing, Benjamin began to notice unusual aspects of the deal that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Blackwood insisted on conducting all business through encrypted email and refused to meet in person or even speak by telephone, Benjamin explained. He also required that I sign extensive confidentiality agreements that prohibited me from discussing the sale with anyone, including other real estate professionals and government officials. But the most disturbing aspect of the transaction was Blackwood's detailed knowledge of Chisana's dark history. During their email exchanges, he demonstrated an intimate familiarity with events that had occurred in the town over a century ago, including incidents that were not documented in any public records. Blackwood knew about specific people who had died in Chisana during the gold rush, including details about how they died and where their bodies were buried, Benjamin recalled. He mentioned families who had resorted to cannibalism during the winter of 1913-14, and he seemed particularly interested in the locations where these incidents had occurred. Benjamin began researching Chisana's history more thoroughly, hoping to understand why his client was so fascinated by the town's violent past. What he discovered made him question whether he should proceed with the sale. "The more I learned about Chisana, the more disturbed I became," Benjamin explained. The town had not just experienced isolated incidents of cannibalism, it had been systematically consumed by it. During the harsh winter of 1913-14, when supply lines were cut off and game became scarce, entire families had turned to eating their neighbors. By spring, less than half the population remained alive. The historical records that Benjamin uncovered painted a picture of a community that had descended into madness as starvation drove people to increasingly desperate measures. Survivors' accounts described organized hunting parties that targeted weaker community members, ritualistic consumption of human flesh, and the transformation of Chisana into what one observer called a town of ghouls. One diary entry from a survivor named Margaret Wilson described finding the Hendricks family's cabin filled with human bones that had been carefully cleaned and sorted. Benjamin continued. She wrote that the bones were arranged in patterns on the floor, as if the Hendricks family had been using them for some kind of ritual or ceremony before they themselves disappeared. Benjamin's research revealed that the cannibalism in Chisana had not been limited to desperate survival measures. Several accounts suggested that some residents had developed a taste for human flesh and had continued hunting and consuming their neighbors even after supply lines were restored in the spring. A territorial marshal who investigated the situation in May 1914 reported finding evidence that at least 12 people had been murdered and eaten after food supplies had become available again, Benjamin explained. He concluded that some residents of Chisana had become addicted to cannibalism and were unable or unwilling to return to normal food sources. As Benjamin learned more about Chisana's history, he began to understand why Harrison Blackwood was so interested in purchasing the town. The patterns that the client had inquired about, the specific locations he wanted to access, and his fascination with the cannibalism incidents all suggested that Blackwood was not planning to establish a conventional retreat center. I started to suspect that Blackwood was part of some kind of cult or organization that was interested in continuing the cannibalistic practices that had made Chisana infamous, Benjamin revealed. His questions about burial sites, his knowledge of specific murders, and his insistence on complete privacy all pointed to activities that would be illegal and horrifying. Benjamin decided to investigate his client more thoroughly, hoping to determine whether his suspicions were justified. But when he tried to verify Harrison Blackwood's identity and the legitimacy of his investment group, he discovered that neither existed in any official capacity. The corporate registration documents that Blackwood had provided were all fabricated, Benjamin explained. The investment group he claimed to represent had no legal existence, and the bank accounts he was using to fund the purchase were registered to entities that could not be traced through normal channels. Benjamin also discovered that the confidentiality agreements he had signed contained clauses that would make him legally liable for damages if he disclosed information about the transaction to law enforcement or government agencies. The agreements had been carefully crafted to ensure his silence, even if he discovered illegal activities. I realized that I had been manipulated into facilitating a transaction for people who were planning to use Chisana for purposes that I did not want to be associated with, Benjamin said. But I was also legally bound by contracts that made it difficult for me to back out of the deal or report my suspicions to authorities. As the closing date approached, Benjamin made the decision to travel to Chisana personally to conduct a final inspection of the properties. He hoped that seeing the town firsthand would either confirm his suspicions or reassure him that his fears were unfounded. The flight to Chisana was one of the most unsettling experiences of my life, Benjamin recalled. The pilot who flew me there was reluctant to land and kept talking about how the town gave him bad feelings. and how he had heard stories about people who went there and were never the same afterwards. When Benjamin arrived in Chisana, he found that the town was not as abandoned as he had expected. Several buildings showed signs of recent maintenance and occupation, and there were fresh supplies and equipment that suggested someone had been using the town as a base of operations. I found a building that had been converted into what could only be described as a processing facility, Benjamin explained. There were meat-cutting tables, preservation equipment, and storage areas that were designed for handling large quantities of organic material. The smell in the building was indescribable, a combination of decay and chemicals that made me physically ill. Benjamin also discovered evidence that suggested the current occupants of Chisana were engaged in activities that confirmed his worst fears about Harrison Blackwood's intentions. I found human remains, Benjamin said, not historical remains from the gold rush era, but recent bones that showed clear evidence of having been processed for consumption. There were cut marks consistent with butchering, and the bones had been cleaned and sorted in the same patterns that historical accounts had described from the 1913 to 14 cannibalism incidents. Benjamin realized that he had stumbled upon an active cannibalistic operation that was using Chisana's isolated location and dark history as cover for ongoing crimes. But when he tried to leave the town to report his discoveries, he found that his pilot had abandoned him. The plane was gone when I returned to the airstrip, Benjamin explained. I was stranded in Chisana with no means of communication and no way to escape. That was when I realized that the whole real estate transaction had been a setup designed to lure me to the town so that I could become part of whatever operation was taking place there. Benjamin spent 3 days hiding in the abandoned buildings of Chisana while trying to avoid the people who were clearly searching for him. During this time, he witnessed activities that confirmed his suspicions about the cannibalistic cult that had taken over the town. I saw them hunting, Benjamin said. They were using Chisana as a base for capturing people who ventured into the remote areas of eastern Alaska, hikers, hunters, prospectors who would not be missed immediately. They would bring their victims back to the town for processing and consumption. Benjamin also discovered that the cult was not a recent phenomenon, but had been operating in Chisana for decades, possibly since the original cannibalism incidents of 1913 to 14. The group had maintained the town as a base of operations while carefully managing its reputation as an abandoned ghost town to avoid unwanted attention. I found records going back to the 1940s documenting their activities, Benjamin explained. They had been systematically luring people to Chisana through various schemes, fake job offers, fraudulent land deals, and other deceptions designed to provide them with victims. The real estate transaction was just their latest method for acquiring prey. Benjamin finally managed to escape from Chisana by following an old mining trail that led to a seasonal hunting camp where he was able to get help from other hunters. But his ordeal had left him psychologically traumatized and physically damaged by exposure and starvation. When I finally made it back to civilization, I reported everything I had discovered to the Alaska State Police, Benjamin said. But when they investigated Chisana, they found that the town had been completely cleaned out. All evidence of the cannibalistic operation had been removed, and there was no trace of the cult members who had been using the town. Benjamin's reports were initially dismissed as the delusions of someone who had suffered psychological trauma from being lost in the wilderness. But when other missing persons cases were linked to the Chisana area, authorities began to take his claims more seriously. Over the past 5 years, at least 8 people have disappeared in the eastern Alaska wilderness under circumstances that match the patterns I described, Benjamin explained. All of them were experienced outdoors people who should have been able to survive in the wilderness, and none of their bodies have ever been recovered. Benjamin Torres never completed the real estate transaction for Chisana, and Harrison Blackwood disappeared without pursuing legal action for breach of contract. But Benjamin continues to believe that the cannibalistic cult is still operating in the area, using Chisana or other remote locations as bases for their activities. The real estate listing for Chisana is still active, Benjamin concluded, but I warn anyone who might be interested in the property that the town is not actually abandoned. It is occupied by people who view visitors not as potential buyers, but as potential meals. The gold rush may be over, but the hunger that consumed Chisana during its darkest days has never ended. Benjamin's experience serves as a reminder that Alaska's remote locations can harbor secrets that are far more dangerous than wildlife or harsh weather conditions. Sometimes the greatest threat in the wilderness comes not from natural forces, but from people who have chosen to embrace the darkest aspects of human nature in places where civilization's rules do not apply. The abandoned buildings of Chisana continue to stand in the Alaska wilderness, officially empty but possibly occupied by those who have made cannibalism not just a survival strategy, but a way of life that has persisted for over a century in one of America's most isolated communities. Dr. Victoria Novak came to Alaska to study permafrost thaw. Her research station near the ghost town of Knik was supposed to be routine climate work. Instead, she discovered that some things are buried in permafrost for a very good reason. What she found beneath the thawing ground would reveal that climate change was not just releasing greenhouse gases. It was awakening something that had been deliberately entombed in ice for over a century. Dr. Victoria Novak had spent 15 years studying Arctic permafrost when the University of Alaska Anchorage awarded her a research grant to establish a monitoring station in the Susitna Valley. The location, near the abandoned town of Knik, had been chosen for its proximity to both active permafrost zones and historical settlement areas that might provide baseline data for long-term climate studies. Knik had been a thriving trading post and transportation hub in the early 1900s, serving prospectors heading to the Iditarod goldfields. But the town had been abandoned after the construction of the Alaska Railroad shifted commerce to other routes, leaving behind a scattered collection of deteriorating buildings and foundations, slowly being reclaimed by the boreal forest. The Knik site was perfect for my research, Dr. Novak explained. It had extensive permafrost that was experiencing rapid thaw due to rising temperatures, and the historical settlement provided an opportunity to study how human activity had affected ground conditions over time. I expected to document typical permafrost degradation patterns and collect data on methane and carbon dioxide emissions. Dr. Novak established her research station in August 2023, setting up monitoring equipment and core sampling tools in a grid pattern around the abandoned town site. Her initial readings confirmed what she had expected. The permafrost was thawing at an accelerated rate, releasing stored carbon and creating unstable ground conditions throughout the area. But as Dr. Novak began taking deeper core samples to analyze permafrost composition and age, she discovered that the ground beneath Knik contained more than just organic matter and geological material. Embedded in the permanently frozen soil were artifacts and structures that predated the town's establishment by decades. At a depth of 12 feet, I found what appeared to be wooden planking arranged in geometric patterns, Dr. Novak recalled. The wood was perfectly preserved by the permafrost, and the construction techniques were unlike anything used in typical frontier buildings. The planks were joined with iron fittings that showed evidence of deliberate corrosion resistance, as if whoever built these structures expected them to remain buried for a very long time. Dr. Novak initially assumed she had discovered the remains of an earlier settlement, or perhaps storage facilities that had been built and abandoned before Knik became a trading post. But as she expanded her excavation work, she found evidence that the buried structures were not conventional buildings, but rather some kind of containment system designed to seal something within the permafrost. The wooden structures formed chambers that were lined with metal sheeting and sealed with what appeared to be tar or pitch, Dr. Novak continued. The chambers were arranged in a precise grid pattern that extended over several acres, and each one contained organic material that had been carefully wrapped and preserved. At first, I thought these might be food storage areas or possibly burial sites. But when Dr. Novak began analyzing the organic material she had found in the sealed chambers, she discovered that it was not food supplies or human remains. The samples contained biological material that did not match any known plant or animal species in the Alaska Regional Database. The tissue samples showed cellular structures that were unlike anything I had seen before, Dr. Novak explained. They appeared to be organic, but the cell walls were reinforced with mineral deposits that suggested an adaptation to extreme environmental conditions. Some of the samples also contained what appeared to be spores or eggs that remained viable despite having been frozen for over a century. Dr. Novak sent samples to the University of Alaska's biology department for further analysis, but the results only deepened the mystery. The tissue samples contained genetic material that did not match any known species, and the spores showed signs of activity when exposed to temperatures above freezing. The biology department's report suggested that the material might represent an unknown species of fungus, or possibly a hybrid organism that had been created through some kind of biological manipulation, Dr. Novak continued. But what disturbed me most was that the spores began to grow rapidly when they were removed from the permafrost environment. Dr. Novak also discovered historical documents buried with the organic material. Letters, reports, and official correspondence that provided disturbing context for the containment chamber she had found. The documents revealed that the buried material had been deliberately entombed in the permafrost as part of a government quarantine operation in 1897. The documents described an outbreak of what they called the hunger sickness that had affected several native villages in the region during the winter of 1896 to 97, Dr. Novak explained. According to the reports, people who contracted the sickness developed an insatiable appetite for human flesh and lost the ability to digest normal food sources. The condition appeared to be contagious and spread rapidly through affected communities. The government response to the outbreak had been swift and brutal. Federal agents and military personnel had been dispatched to quarantine the affected villages, and anyone who showed symptoms of the hunger sickness had been killed, and their remains sealed in the permafrost chambers to prevent further spread. One report from a military doctor described the affected individuals as having undergone physical transformations that made them no longer recognizably human. Dr. Novak continued. He wrote that their teeth had become elongated and sharpened. Their digestive systems had adapted to process raw flesh, and their behavior had become increasingly aggressive and predatory. The military doctor's reports also suggested that the hunger sickness was not a natural disease, but had been caused by exposure to some kind of biological agent that had been discovered in a cave system near the affected villages. The doctor wrote that the cave contained what appeared to be preserved specimens of unknown organisms that had been exposed by mining activity. Dr. Novak explained. When members of a prospecting party consumed what they thought was preserved meat they found in the cave, they contracted the hunger sickness and spread it to their home communities. Dr. Novak realized that climate change was causing the permafrost chambers to thaw, potentially releasing the biological agents that had caused the 1897 outbreak. But when she tried to report her findings to public health authorities, she discovered that information about the hunger sickness had been classified by the federal government for over a century. I contacted the CDC and the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services to report the potential biological hazard, Dr. Novak explained. But both agencies told me that my research had uncovered classified materials related to national security, and that I was legally prohibited from discussing my findings with anyone outside of authorized government personnel. Dr. Novak was visited by representatives from the Department of Defense, who informed her that her research site was being designated as a restricted area and that her work would continue under military supervision. The scientists who took over her research were primarily concerned with containing the biological agents rather than studying their origins or potential applications. The military scientists told me that similar outbreaks had occurred throughout Alaska and northern Canada during the late 1800s, and that the government had been monitoring permafrost sites for decades to prevent accidental exposure to the preserved biological agents, Dr. Novak continued. They said that climate change was creating a significant national security risk by thawing containment sites that had been stable for over a century. But Dr. Novak also learned that some government agencies were interested in studying the biological agents for potential military applications. The organisms that caused the hunger sickness appeared to have properties that could be useful for biological warfare or crowd control applications. I overheard conversations between the military scientists about weaponizing the organisms, Dr. Novak revealed. They were discussing ways to modify the biological agents to create controllable outbreaks that could be deployed against enemy populations or used to suppress civil unrest. Dr. Novak became increasingly concerned that her climate research had inadvertently contributed to the development of biological weapons, and she began documenting the military activities at her former research site. But when she tried to expose the government's plans, she found that her security clearance had been revoked and that she was being monitored by federal agents. I was told that my continued involvement in climate research would be contingent on my cooperation with the biological weapons program, Dr. Novak explained. When I refused to participate, I was dismissed from my university position and my research grants were terminated. Dr. Novak went public with her discoveries in 2024, publishing a paper detailing her findings and warning that permafrost thaw was releasing biological hazards that posed significant risks to public health and safety. But her warnings were dismissed by most of the scientific community as conspiracy theories or the result of research stress. The government has been very effective at discrediting my research and portraying me as an unstable scientist who has made unsubstantiated claims about non-existent biological agents, Dr. Novak concluded. But I have physical evidence of the organisms I discovered, and I have documented proof that the government is using climate change as cover for biological weapons research. Dr. Novak continues to monitor permafrost thaw sites throughout Alaska, looking for evidence of additional containment chambers and biological hazards that may be released by rising temperatures. She has identified several locations where historical records suggest similar quarantine operations may have taken place during the late 1800s. Climate change is not just releasing carbon dioxide and methane from thawing permafrost, Dr. Novak warned. It is also releasing biological agents that were deliberately buried in the ice because they were too dangerous to destroy. The government knows this is happening, but they are more interested in weaponizing these organisms than in protecting public health. The abandoned buildings of CNIC continue to decay slowly in the Alaskan wilderness, but according to Dr. Novak, the real danger lies not in the visible ruins, but in what is hidden beneath the thawing permafrost. As temperatures continue to rise and more containment sites are compromised, she believes that Alaska may face outbreaks of hunger sickness that could spread far beyond the state's borders. The CNIC site was just the beginning, Dr. Novak concluded. There are dozens of similar locations throughout Alaska and northern Canada where biological agents were buried in permafrost during the late 1800s and early 1900s. As these sites thaw, we may discover that some things were meant to stay frozen forever. Dr. Novak's research suggests that ghost towns like CNIC may be abandoned not just because of economic factors or transportation changes, but because they were built on ground that contained biological hazards too dangerous for human habitation. Climate change may be turning these seemingly harmless ruins into active threats that could transform Alaska's empty settlements into something far more sinister than mere historical curiosities. The permafrost beneath Alaska's ghost towns may be preserving more than just artifacts and organic matter. It may be preserving nightmares that were buried in ice to protect humanity from horrors that previous generations had encountered and barely survived. As the ice melts and the ground thaws, these nightmares may be awakening from their century-long sleep, ready to reclaim the territories they once ruled through fear and hunger. According to Dr. Victoria Novak, Alaska's ghost towns are not empty. They are waiting. And as the permafrost continues to thaw, they may not remain abandoned much longer.